Maps is just some of the new material that was recently added to Magellan TV. Magellan TV adds 15 to 20 hours of new material every week, and they already have a catalog of over 3,000 documentaries. Right now, you can check out Murder Maps and the rest of their documentaries for free because Magellan TV is offering criminally listed viewers a month of free service. To get this amazing offer, go to try.magellantv.com/criminally listed. So please check out Magellan TV today because you'll find something great to watch and you'll be supporting Criminally Listed in the process. Number 3. Marcello Fabian Piccolo. In 2007, Marcello Fabian Piccolo was a music teacher at his school in Merlo, Argentina. Merlo is a city in the greater Buenos Aires urban area. In October 2007, a 4-year-old accused him of sexually touching him. After the allegation, 6 more students between the ages of 3 and 8 came forward. They also said that Piccolo inappropriately touched them. He was arrested and placed in prison, but he was released after 9 months and placed under house arrest. But this led to a series of protests. The protesters wore shirts and held up signs that read, "With the children, no." Then they burned his house down. So he went back to jail while he awaited his trial. A judge decided that 5 of the 7 cases would be heard in court. In 2010, out of the 5 cases, he was convicted of 1. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but his sentence was drastically reduced and he ended up only serving 4 years in prison. After leaving prison, he got a job with the Little Orchestra of Moran as a substitute trumpet player. Moran is another city in the Buenos Aires metro area, about 7 miles from Merlo. He was made a permanent member of the orchestra in May 2016. On October 30th, 2016, the orchestra was playing in the Cathedral of Moran. Suddenly, a group of adults burst into the church. A few of them shouted, "There is a pedophile and a rapist in the church, and he is playing in this orchestra." Several of them were wearing t-shirts that read, "With the children, no." They also hung up posters in the church with the same slogan. Then they advanced on 42-year-old Marcello Fabian Piccolo. He tried to run out of the door behind the altar, but someone got there first and locked it. Then the crowd swarmed him. One man took his trumpet and beat him with it. They beat him until blood came out of his mouth. Several people tried to protect Piccolo and they were injured as well. By the time the priest had entered the church, the mob had left. The priest stayed with Piccolo, who was unconscious and badly battered. The police were called and officers were there quickly because the station was only a block from the church. However, there were not many clues besides eyewitness accounts. Piccolo's trumpet was missing and it has never been found. 42-year-old Marcello Fabian Piccolo was taken to the hospital. He stayed in a coma for a month and then died in the hospital. No arrests have ever been made in the case. Number 2. Katie Benson. In 1991, 63-year-old Edward Benson and his 60-year-old wife, Katie, lived in West Milton, Ohio. West Milton is a small village with a population of just over 4,000 people. The couple had 7 children and many grandchildren. Katie had been a homemaker. Edward had health issues, so he couldn't work. But he did play banjo in a bluegrass band. On May 22, 1991, at 5 a.m., Edward called 911. He said that his wife needed paramedics. He then called his lawyer. When the first responders arrived, Edward's lawyer was already at the couple's home, and he advised Edward not to answer any questions. Inside the couple's house, the police found what they described as a gruesome crime scene. 60-year-old Katie had suffered severe head wounds. 2 bloody banjos were found near her. 60-year-old Katie Benson was placed in the ambulance, but she died on the way to the hospital. The police concluded that Edward started beating Katie in the head with one of the banjos. When the banjo broke, he picked up another one and continued to beat her in the head. Once he was done, he called 911. The lead investigator said, "I've been an officer for 30 years, and it's the first banjo killing I've seen." What the police didn't know was why Edward killed his wife of several decades. The police had been called to their home because of domestic disputes, but not in the last few years. The neighbors did not hear any arguments in the time leading up to the murder. 5 months after the murder, a judge ruled that Edward was incompetent to stand trial. He committed him to a psychiatric hospital for at least 15 months. Edward Benson never stood trial for murder. He died at the age of 65 in October 1993, 2.5 years after the murder. He was buried in a different cemetery than the wife he murdered. Number 1. Danny Kirk Sr. Forest Hill is a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas. In 2011, it had a population of about 12,000 people. It was home to 53-year-old Danny Kirk Sr. and his family. Kirk was the founder and pastor of the Greater Sweet Home Missionary Baptist Church. He started the church in a strip mall in 1995. The church grew, and years later, a red brick church was constructed. Kirk was also an unofficial volunteer chaplain for a local high school football team. By all accounts, Reverend Kirk was a hard-working and good man. On October 29, 2011, 53-year-old Danny Kirk was at church with the church's secretary and the custodian. Suddenly, a car slammed into the side of the church. A man got out of the car and chased Kirk into the music room. Once in the room, the man started beating Kirk with an electric guitar. The church's secretary locked herself in the office and called 911. The custodian rushed to the music room, and he was also attacked. The police arrived, and at gunpoint, they ordered the attacker to stop. But he ignored the officers. So they shot him with a taser, and he finally stopped. They handcuffed him and put him in the back of a police cruiser. The officers provided first aid to Reverend Kirk and the custodian until paramedics arrived. When the paramedics arrived, they were both taken to the hospital. About 10 minutes after the attacker was placed in the back seat, an officer checked on him and discovered he wasn't breathing. He was also taken to the hospital. The custodian was not too badly injured. Sadly, 53-year-old Reverend Danny Kirk Sr. was pronounced dead at the hospital. So was his killer. The police identified him as 33-year-old Derek Bordeaux. Bordeaux was married and had 4 children. He worked as a truck driver. He was not a member of Kirk's congregation, but he had attended several services there. He did not know Kirk or have any personal connection to him. Bordeaux had a criminal record, which included violence. In 1999, he was convicted of possession of a controlled substance, and he was sentenced to 120 days in jail. The following year, he was sentenced to 45 days in jail for assaulting a family member. In 2004, he was sentenced to 35 days in jail for driving drunk. Later that same year, Bordeaux pleaded guilty to aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. He shot a man he said owed him money. The man survived the shooting. Bordeaux was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Bordeaux's family said he had never previously shown signs of mental illness. But in the week leading up to Reverend Kirk's murder, Rideau's family said he was acting very strangely. It was then clear to his family that he was mentally ill. He was very jittery, and he would talk on the phone with his dead grandmother. He kept telling his brother that someone had stuck him with a needle. When his brother asked him who had stuck him, he would say, "Nobody." Rideau was also convinced that someone was coming to kill him. His family encouraged him to check himself into a hospital, but he refused. It's not clear why he chose to attack Reverend Danny Kirk. An autopsy was performed on Rideau's body. Turned out that he was high on phencyclidine, also known as PCP or angel dust. PCP is a powerful, dissociative, hallucinogenic drug that can have mind-altering effects. PCP would explain Rideau's erratic behavior in the week leading up to Kirk's murder and his death. Rideau's cause of death was from PCP ingestion. The Greater Sweet Home Missionary Baptist Church did not die with Danny Kirk Sr. Another founding member took over as pastor, and the church is still in operation. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out our new channel, Paranormally Listed. Our latest video is about 3 celebrity UFO encounters. You can find a link to the channel on the screen now and in the description box below this video. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching. We have recently launched a new podcast called Into the Killing. In each episode, we cover cold cases that were solved, often decades after the crime was committed. In our latest episode, we discussed 2 cold cases that were solved without the benefit of DNA technology. You can find Into the Killing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and anywhere else you find great podcasts. But before we get into today's video, we want to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, Magellan TV. I've been watching Magellan TV for about a year and a half now, and I love my subscription. I hope you're enjoying yours as well. Right now, Magellan TV has an amazing deal. When you buy 1 gift card, you'll get another gift card for free. Why not give someone in your life the gift of knowledge and get a subscription for yourself? To find out more and to take advantage of this amazing deal, just click on the link in the description box. There's a banner at the bottom of the page. Not only will you get a free gift card, but you'll get an additional month of Magellan TV even if you're already a member. That is an amazing deal. Magellan TV just has so many great documentaries. I highly recommend Tessa Beatriz, A Life Interrupted. It's a convoluted story about a woman trying to smuggle 10 kilos of cocaine through a Brazilian airport. And this is just one of 3,000 documentaries featured on Magellan TV. Magellan TV can be watched anywhere, at any time, on your TV, laptop, or mobile device. You can also cast from your phone to your TV. It works with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, iOS, Google Play, and so many more. Besides the amazing gift card offer, Magellan TV has a special offer for criminally listed viewers. Just go to try.magellantv.com/criminally listed. You'll get a month for free. This is also the link to check out the gift card offer. Please help support Criminally Listed and find something interesting to watch by checking out Magellan TV. Number 3. Carl Erickson. Norman Johnson was born in June 1939. He grew up in Madison, South Dakota, and he attended Madison High School. When he attended high school, the city only had a population of about 5,000 people. Norman was a star athlete. He was the starting running back for the school's football team. He was a popular young man, and he dated a cheerleader named Barbara. In 1958, the same year that Norman graduated from high school, he married Barbara. Norman went to university in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where he played football. He earned a degree in education. He would later attain his master's. After Norman graduated, he moved back to Madison. He got a job at his former high school as an English teacher and coach. He coached track, football, and tennis. Barbara went on to have 2 daughters. Norman was an active member of his church. He sang in the choir and he was an usher. Norman ended up teaching and coaching for 35 years and then he retired. Norman and Barbara watched their daughters grow up. They went on to give them 4 grandchildren. On the night of January 31st, 2012, Norman and Barbara were at home. There was a knock at the door and Norman answered it. The man at the door asked Norman if he was Norman Johnson. Norman didn't respond right away, so the man asked him again. Norman confirmed that was his name. The man at the door pulled out a .45 caliber handgun and shot Norman twice in the face. The 72-year-old grandfather died nearly instantly. Barbara found her husband of 54 years dead on the floor, and she called 911. She saw an elderly white man with gray hair and a beard walking away from the doorway. Madison was not used to dealing with murders. The last one happened over a century earlier in 1906. Many of the citizens left their keys in their car when they ran errands, and they didn't lock the doors of their homes. In the hours after the murder, the people in the town were on high alert. Many residents left their porch lights on to help the police in their search. Many officers who were involved in the investigation knew Norman because he had been their teacher in high school. Later that same night, the police were alerted that a man matching the description of the shooter was spotted at another home in Madison. It appeared that he was trying to break into the home. Like Norman, the homeowner was a retired teacher and coach at Madison High School. A short time later, the shooter was spotted near the home of Dick Erickson. Dick was a lawyer and he had been a city councilman in Madison. Dick was not at home when the man was spotted. Dick was interviewed and he said that he believed that his brother, 73-year-old Carl Erickson, was most likely the shooter. Dick said that Carl hated Norman Johnson because of an alleged incident that happened 50 years earlier when Carl and Norman were both students at Madison High School. Norman was a year younger than Carl. Carl did not play any sports. Instead, he was a sports manager. Supposedly, one day in the locker room, someone put a jockstrap on Carl's head. This led to the boys on the team laughing at him. Dick did not know if Norman put the jockstrap on his head or if he did something like laugh the hardest. Regardless of what happened, Carl hated Norman because of the situation. Even 5 decades later, Carl talked about how much he loathed Norman. Dick was not sure why his brother would have gone to the other retired teacher's home. That teacher didn't attend high school with Carl and Norman. But Dick did know why Carl came by his home. Dick explained that his brother was mentally ill and he had been threatening to kill him for years. Dick thought it was possible that, because of Carl's mental illness, that the jockstrap incident may not have happened. He could have just made it up in his head. The police investigated Carl Erickson's background. He did not have a criminal record. After graduating from Madison High School, Carl went to university in North Dakota. He then moved to Wyoming. In 1968, Carl got married, and at the time of the shooting, he was still married. For 25 years, Carl worked as a federal government insurance officer. After he retired, he and his wife moved to Watertown, South Dakota. After talking to Dick, the police went to Carl's home in Watertown, which is over 60 miles from Madison. Carl admitted that he was in Madison on the day Norman was shot, and he did have his gun with him. But he denied killing Norman Johnson. The police got a search warrant, and inside Carl's home, they found the gun, which was determined to be the murder weapon. In May 2012, Carl Erickson pleaded guilty but mentally ill to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. At the time of this video, 82-year-old Carl Erickson is incarcerated at the Jameson Annex in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Number 3. Alfred Buzo Jr. Prince Edward Island is Canada's smallest province. The island on the east coast is home to about 140,000 people. It's a picturesque and peaceful area famous for its potatoes and red sand beaches. It's best known as the setting for the beloved children's series Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. On November 19, 1970, Alfred Buzo was driving on a rural road towards his home on the outskirts of Montague, which is a small town on the eastern part of the island. In the van was Alfred, his wife Bernice, their 9-year-old daughter Kathy, and their 2-year-old son, Alfred Jr., who went by the name Alfie. As they were driving through an intersection, a half-ton truck T-boned their van. Kathy went through the windshield. The police and an ambulance were called for. When the police officer arrived, he found Alfred walking around. He was injured and he had debris in his shoulder. Bernice was holding Alfie, the toddler. He looked around and he found the dead body of 9-year-old Kathy in the ditch. He then went to the truck and opened the door. Inside the cab of the truck was Herb McGuigan. Herb was uninjured and he was lying on the floor of his truck. He didn't appear to understand what was going on. He asked the officer if there had been an accident. On the floor of the cab of the truck were caps from beer bottles. Herb's eyes were watery and he smelled of alcohol. Herb was arrested and he was charged with drinking and driving. Alfred Buzo was taken to the hospital and he was released. The collision was a tragic situation. The police officer said that had either of the vehicles entered the intersection a second earlier or later, they would have never collided with each other. Kathy was buried in the cemetery beside the church that was close to the family's home. Anytime they drove into town, they passed the cemetery. A trial was held in 1971 and Herb pleaded not guilty. He was convicted and he was sentenced to just 9 months in jail and he was banned from driving for a year. The Buzo family was deeply upset by the sentence. They thought it was way too lenient. The death of Kathy and Herb's family was incredibly hard on the family. Alfred and Bernice began to drink and they argued frequently. Alfred spent time in a psychiatric hospital. Their son, Alfie, didn't fare much better. He had problems making friends in school. He failed the first grade and he had to redo it. He failed the 8th grade twice. He ended up dropping out of school when he was 15. Alfie worked at several menial jobs like a fish plant, and he was on a road crew. He rarely dated, he never got married, and he never had children. At one time, he did live with a woman, but it didn't work out. In 2011, Alfie's father, Alfred, passed away. In August 2014, Alfie was finishing up a contract as a night watchman at a marina. He was a loner, he was single, and his best friend was his dog. Herb McGuigan had a son named Brent. In August 2014, Brent was 68 years old. He was a father and a grandfather. On the night of August 20th, 2014, Brent was at home with his wife, Marie. That night, their son, 39-year-old Brendan, stopped off at their home. Brent had been fixing a backhoe, and Brendan wanted to see how it was going. Brendan wasn't planning on staying very long. He wanted to get home to his wife and his 3 children. They were planning on watching a TV show together. His wife was pregnant with their 4th child. At about 9 p.m., a man entered Brett and Marie's home through an unlocked door. The McGuigans had no clue who the man was. The man pulled out a .22 caliber handgun and pumped 7 bullets into 39-year-old Brendan. He then pointed the gun at Brendan's father, Brent. But then Brendan moved again, so the man shot him once more. The man then fired 5 bullets into 68-year-old Brent. After shooting both men, the man quietly walked out the door. Marie called 911 immediately. Sadly, nothing could be done for her husband and son. They were both pronounced dead. The next morning, the police received a call from a man named Jeremy Vuzo. He said that his brother, 46-year-old Alfie, had come to his home and told him he did it, he got them. Jeremy was born sometime after the accident. Jeremy explained that for years, Alfie had talked about getting revenge on the McGuigan family, but no one had taken him seriously. Alfie was arrested at his home a short time later. While he was in custody, Alfie talked to a psychiatrist. He blamed the McGuigan family for ruining his life. He decided to get revenge by killing Brent McGuigan. The psychiatrist diagnosed Alfie with pervasive depressive disorder and obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. The psychiatrist said that people with this combination of disorders are generally unforgiving and moralistic and tend to brood or obsess over issues. Alfie said that he had not expected Brendan to be there, but decided to kill him regardless. Since the collision happened 44 years earlier, 5 years before Brendan was born, there was a possibility that Brendan never even knew about the accident. The McGuigan family didn't know who Alfie was. Only one member of the McGuigan family remembered having a run-in with the Vuzo family after the collision. That was Herb's other son, Ivan McGuigan. Ivan said that one time at a dance at the Legion Hall, Bernice, Alfie's mother, slapped him and told him that his father, Herb, was an awful person. Ivan also said that one time he had worked with Alfie's father, Alfred Sr., on a job, and they had gotten along. In February 2015, Alfie Vuzo pleaded guilty to first-degree murder for killing Brent and second-degree murder for murdering Brendan. In April 2015, there was a sentencing hearing, and it was contentious. The prosecution argued that Alfie should have to wait 50 years before he could apply for parole. Alfie testified. He slammed the 9-month sentence that Herb McGuigan received for killing his sister 44 years earlier. He said that's all her life was worth. She only had 9 years in this world, and nobody cared. It's haunted me all my life. Marie, who was Brent's wife and Brendan's mother, testified. She said, I feel so much anger and hatred that it scares me. I hate that they died this way, and it haunts me. Marie was allowed to directly address Alfie. She asked him why he didn't kill her. Alfie told her that was because she was a woman. After this comment, Brent's second son and Brendan's brother, Alan, said, I won't go easy on your mother, bud. There won't be a Buzo left alive in Montague, sucker. Alfie responded, I'll remember that. Alan was promptly kicked out of the courtroom for the comment. Alfie ended up being given 2 life sentences without the chance of parole until he served 35 years. That means he'll be able to apply for parole for the first time when he's 81 years old. After Alfie was sentenced, he flipped out. At the family of his victims, he shouted, You sentenced me to life, and I sent them to death. As he was being led out of the courtroom, he screamed, You guys, at the McGuigans. The murders had devastating effects on both the McGuigan and Buzo families. Brendan's wife gave birth to their 4th child 4 months after he was murdered. She ended up selling their home and moving away from the area because she thought that the house was too lonely without Brandon. Alfie's mother also sold her home and moved away. The double murder is considered one of the most notorious homicides in the history of Prince Edward Island. Number 1. Anthony Garcia. William and Claire Hunter lived in an upscale neighborhood in Omaha, Nebraska. William and Claire were doctors, and they worked at the Creighton University Medical Center. Claire was a cardiologist, and William was the head of the pathology residency program. The couple had 4 sons. On March 13, 2008, Claire was out of town at a conference. William finished work at around 5 p.m. and then he drove home. When William arrived home, he noticed something odd. The car belonging to their housekeeper, Shirley Sherman, was parked in the driveway. She was usually gone by the time he arrived home. Nevertheless, William walked in the back door of the house. A few steps from the door, he found the dead body of 57-year-old Shirley Sherman. Her body was in a pool of blood and a knife was embedded in her neck. It was clear that she was dead. In a panic, William searched the rest of the house. His youngest son, 11-year-old Thomas, was the only one who still lived at home. He was 8 years younger than his next oldest sibling. On the dining room floor, William found the dead body of his 11-year-old son, Thomas. Like Sherman, there was a knife embedded in his neck. It was later determined that Sherman had been stabbed 17 times before the knife was left in her neck. Thomas had also been stabbed multiple times. The stab wounds on both victims were in small clusters on the right side of their necks, below the ear and jawline. It appeared that the killer was trying to cut or stab their jugular vein or carotid artery. Both knives came from the family's kitchen. It's believed that when Thomas got home, he went into the basement to play video games. The killer came to the front door and Thomas let him in. The killer made his way to the kitchen and picked up the knives. Thomas most likely ran, and the killer tackled him in the dining room. He then proceeded to stab him. Shirley Sherman was upstairs cleaning when this happened. She may have heard the noises of the attack and came downstairs to investigate. She most likely saw the killer, possibly in the process of murdering Thomas, so she ran towards the back door. The killer chased her and tackled her, and then stabbed her to death. The police had no idea who would want to kill the 11-year-old sixth grader and the family's housekeeper. Nothing had been stolen from the home, and neither victim had been sexually assaulted. Thomas was a bright young man who attended a magnet school for science and technology. He loved video games and books. He wasn't involved in any dangerous behavior like gangs or drugs. Shirley Sherman had a former boyfriend who was abusive, but he was cleared as a suspect. Several people saw a silver Honda CR-V near the crime scene. The police followed up on this lead, but it did not go anywhere. The detectives working on the case asked the FBI for assistance. They suggested it could have been the work of a serial killing drifter and the murders were just random. It wasn't long before the case went cold. On the morning of May 14, 2014, the police were called to another upscale home in Omaha. It had been over 5 years since Thomas Hunter and Shirley Sherman were killed. Some piano movers had found the bodies of Roger and Mary Brumbach, who were both 65. The Brumbachs were packing up to move to a different state. Roger was just a few weeks away from retirement. He was the head of pathology at the Crane University Medical Center. He was the colleague of Thomas Hunter's father, William. The couple had been murdered 2 days earlier, on Mother's Day. It's believed that Roger opened the door to the killer, who was armed with a gun. Roger and the killer struggled with the gun, and the killer managed to fire off 4 shots. Roger was hit 3 times. One of the bullets, which entered his abdomen, was fatal. After the 4 shots were fired, the clip fell out of the gun. It is believed that Mary was drawn to the front door by the sounds of the attack. The killer then proceeded to pistol whip Mary until the gun broke. Then the killer went into the kitchen and grabbed 2 knives. He returned, and Mary fought off the attacker the best she could. There were 20 defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She was stabbed 6 times on the right side of the neck. One of the stabs cut her carotid artery. The killer then walked over to Roger and stabbed him 6 times on the right side of the neck. He left both knives on the floor. Nothing was stolen from the home, and there were no signs of sexual assault. The police immediately thought that the sets of murders were connected. Both had been double murders, and all 4 victims were stabbed in the right side of the neck. They also had connections to the Crane University Medical Center. Specifically, Roger was a member of the pathology department, as was Thomas's father, William. The murders of the Brumbachs made it clear that it wasn't some serial killer choosing victims at random. Instead, the killer appeared to be targeting members of the pathology department. Hours after the Brumbachs' bodies were found, the police learned something that confirmed that theory. Another doctor who worked in the pathology department told the police that on the same day the Brumbachs were killed, someone tried to break into her home. No one was home at the time, and she thought that the security alarm scared them off. The crimes made no sense to the investigators. Why would someone want to hurt the members of the Creighton University Medical Center's pathology department? Pathologists examined dead bodies, so it's not like one of them botched some procedure or surgery that killed someone's loved one or something of that nature. The police began to suspect that the killer had medical training. They thought that the killer's stabbing method was methodical. He seemed to be aiming for the jugular vein or the carotid artery, and if they were cut, it would be fatal in under a minute. The police did not find the killer's fingerprints at either crime scene, so the police thought that the killer may have worn medical gloves. After the murders of the Brungbacks, a task force was formed and the FBI became heavily involved in the investigation. The investigators started going through the medical center's personnel files. In the personnel files, they found a possible suspect, 40-year-old Anthony Garcia. Garcia had been a resident in 2000, 13 years before the Brungbacks were killed. Garcia had a lot of problems in the program. He was considered immature, defiant, and for someone who went to medical school, he had a surprising lack of knowledge. He never took responsibility for his actions, and his problems were always caused by someone else. The final straw was a prank that Garcia pulled. While the chief resident was taking an exam, Garcia had another student call the chief resident's wife. He told the chief resident's wife that her husband was needed at the medical center right away or he'd be fired. William Hunter and Roger Brungback considered the prank harassment, so Garcia was dismissed from the program. He was just 11 months into the 4-year program. Garcia's termination letter was signed by William Hunter and Roger Brungback. The police then looked into Garcia's background. He had a criminal record for driving under the influence, but that was it. What caught the attention of the investigators was that Garcia owned a silver Honda CR-V when Thomas Hunter and Shirley Sherman were killed. It turned out that being dismissed from the program had caused a lot of problems for Garcia. Whenever Garcia applied for jobs in the medical field, he was always asked if he had been fired from a residency program or disciplined in a residency program. He would respond yes, and then he wouldn't get the job. Or he would lie, then get the job, only to be fired later. In February 2008, Anthony was fired from Louisiana State University for omitting that he had been fired from Creighton. 2 weeks later, Thomas Hunter and Shirley Sherman were stabbed to death. In December 2012, about 5 months before the Brungbacks were killed, Garcia was denied a medical license from the Indiana Licensing Board. The police concluded that Anthony Garcia was seeking revenge on the people who fired him in 2001, 7 years before the first murders were committed. The investigators needed to prove that Garcia was in Omaha on the day that either set of murders happened. The police thought that since there were so many similarities between the murders, that was clear that one person committed them. When the first murders were committed, Garcia was living in Shreveport, Louisiana. When the Brungbacks were killed, he was living in Terre Haute, Indiana. The investigators got a hold of Garcia's phone records. It turned out his phone was used near Omaha on the day the Brungbacks were killed. They also got Garcia's financial records. 2 months before the Brungbacks were killed, Garcia purchased the same model of gun used to shoot Roger with his credit card. They also found out that Garcia's credit cards were used to make several purchases in Omaha on the day the Brungbacks were murdered. One purchase was made at a convenience store and another one was made at a restaurant. The restaurant was just a few blocks from the Brumback's house. The investigators went to the convenience store and they got the surveillance footage from that day. Garcia was recorded on tape at the store. This proved Garcia was in Omaha and he couldn't claim that someone stole his credit card and phone. On July 15, 2013, 40-year-old Anthony Garcia was arrested. Garcia went to trial 3 years later in October 2016. After a 3-week trial, the jury deliberated for 6 hours over 2 days. Garcia was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. In the lead up to his trial, Garcia didn't talk to his lawyers or his family. At his sentencing hearing in September 2018, he sat in his wheelchair and either slept or pretended to sleep. He was sentenced to death. 47-year-old Anthony Garcia is sitting on death row at the Tecumseh State Correctional Institution in Tecumseh, Nebraska. No execution date has been set. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Number 3. Ricky Blake. On March 14, 1986, Ricky Blake celebrated her 14th birthday. She lived on a quiet street in Chula Vista, California with her parents, Bill and Alicia, and her older sister, who was also named Alicia, but went by the nickname Bootsy. Ricky's friends and family said that she was an innocent and naive 8th grade girl. She had a boyfriend, but they mostly talked over the phone and they had never kissed. Ricky played with Cabbage Patch dolls and she dressed the dolls in pajamas every night before bed. At about 10 p.m. one night in the spring of 1986, the phone rang in the family's home. One of Bootsy's friends answered the phone. The caller said that his name was George and he was looking for Ricky. The friend thought that George sounded like a man and he was too old to call someone Ricky's age. She told him that and then hung up the phone. This wasn't the only phone call from the man named George. The family had received other phone calls from him and some of them were obscene. On April 10, 1986, about a month after Ricky's birthday, Bill picked up Ricky at school to take her to the dentist. They returned home that night, and Ricky complained that her teeth hurt. For dinner, Ricky had soup and ice cream. Otherwise, it was an average Thursday evening in the Blake household. Sometime between 9 and 9:30, Bill and Alicia went to bed. Ricky stayed up to watch the San Diego Padres game. Bootsy had been out that evening with friends. At 10:30 p.m. she returned home and she had 2 friends with her. Ricky stepped outside to talk with the 3 girls. A few minutes later, the friends left and Ricky and Bootsy went inside. Ricky then got on a 3-way phone call with her boyfriend and one of her friends. While Ricky talked on the phone, Bootsy locked the front and back door. She then made Ricky get off the phone. Sometime between 11 and 11:30 p.m., the phone rang and Bootsy answered it. The caller asked for Ricky. He said his name was George. Bootsy knew 2 Georges, but the caller didn't sound like either George that she knew. In fact, she didn't recognize the voice. Ricky got the phone from her sister, and then she went into her bedroom. Bootsy then went to bed. The next morning, Ricky's mother, Alicia, woke up at 5 a.m. She went into the living room where she found the lights and the television on. The front door was also open. She went into Ricky's bedroom and she wasn't there. It was apparent that she didn't sleep there that night because her bed was still made. Also, her Cabbage Patch dolls had not been changed into their pajamas. Perhaps what was most baffling was that Ricky's shoes were beside the front door. Her mother reasoned that if she went out for a walk, or even ran away from home, she would have at least taken her shoes. Ricky's parents called neighbors and friends, but no one had seen Ricky, so they called the police. That night, at around 10:10 p.m., a call came in to the police. A motorist had found the dead body of a teenage girl lying on an off-ramp to Interstate 5 in San Diego County, about 6 miles from Ricky's home. The body was identified as 14-year-old Ricky Blake. She was wearing black pants and a pink sweatshirt, which were the clothes that she was wearing when her family last saw her alive. She wasn't wearing any shoes, and her socks were dirty. An autopsy was performed, and the cause of death was most likely strangulation, but she may have also been suffocated. There was fluid in her lungs, so it's even possible that she might have been drowned. Ricky had bruises on her face and head. It is thought she was punched, hit with a bottle, or her head was slammed into a flat surface. Ricky had a blood alcohol level of 0.4, which is a level that usually leads to unconsciousness. The medical examiner said that this could have been the result of decomposition, or she may have been force-fed alcohol. Before she died, Ricky had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner thought that she had been killed at about 1 a.m. on the day that her body was found. The police determined that she was most likely killed elsewhere and then dumped on the off-ramp. The police never did find where Ricky was killed, and the lack of a crime scene hampered their investigation. Their strongest lead was the phone calls from the man named George. The police interviewed students at Ricky's school, and some of them said that a man named George had called them as well. But no one knew who George was. Shortly after Ricky's murder, her family started to receive strange phone calls. Their home phone number was unlisted. The caller, who was male, would ask if Ricky was there, and then he would laugh and hang up. Another time, he called and played Ricky's favorite song, With You All the Way by New Edition. Then the calls died off, but the caller didn't stop harassing Ricky's family. Ricky's birthday was March 14th, and days before her first birthday after her murder, the calls started again. The person continued to call for a month, up to the anniversary of Ricky's murder. He would call at 3 or 4 in the morning, and he would only talk to Ricky's mother, Alicia. Any time that Ricky's father Bill would answer the phone, the caller would hang up. When Alicia talked to him, he would ask her if she wanted to know how Ricky died. Alicia would say she didn't want to know that, she just wanted to know who killed her. On other calls, he would recount Alicia's movements. He told her he watched her as she left her house, and he would say that he saw her at the cemetery. These calls happened every year for about a decade, and then they tapered off. Alicia said at first the calls used to frighten her. She even sent Bootsy to live with relatives out of fear that she might be harmed. But after a while she became less frightened because she felt dead inside, and she thought that there was no way she could be hurt further. She said she actually started looking forward to the calls because she was hoping that he may say something that would lead to an arrest. But he never did. The police tapped the family's phone, but they were never able to identify the caller. Besides the phone calls, Ricky's family also noticed other unusual happenings. For example, they stored Ricky's clothes in boxes that were labeled with her name in their garage. The family discovered that someone had stolen clothes from the boxes. They also found odd things at her grave. One time they found a necklace with a heart pendant. Another time they found some loose change on her grave. Finally, they found a vase on her headstone. Inside the vase was what appeared to be strips of a man's shirt. Ricky's family wasn't sure if the stolen clothing, the items left at the gravesite, and the phone calls were connected. However, since the caller knew their unlisted phone number, knew where they lived, and knew where Ricky was buried, they thought it was definitely possible that one person was stalking them. But they also didn't know if it was just some disturbed person who was harassing them, or if he really was connected to Ricky's murder. But again, they thought it was possible. Before Ricky was murdered, George seemed to be stalking her. He had called their family's unlisted numbers several times. Just hours before she was killed, he had called the house. Since Ricky's shoes were found inside her house, the police assumed that she was kidnapped from her home. When George called, he may have lured her outside. That meant that George knew her address as well as her phone number. But Ricky's family couldn't be sure if George was the same person who called after the murder. Then in February 2003, nearly 17 years after Ricky was killed, the police made an arrest. They had matched DNA found in Ricky's underwear to a man named George Williams Jr. Williams had a horrifying criminal record. Williams was from Gary, Indiana, but in the mid-1980s, he was living in San Diego, California. In 1984, he was arrested for sexually abusing his 6-year-old daughter. In December of that year, he pleaded guilty to lewd acts with a minor under the age of 14. It's not clear what his sentence was, but in 1986, when Ricky was murdered, he was out on parole. A week after Ricky was killed, Williams was visiting his ex-wife at her apartment in San Diego. He had been drinking heavily that night. He left his ex-wife's apartment and he happened upon a woman who lived a few doors down from his ex-wife. Williams followed the woman into her apartment. Williams was armed with a knife and he tied her up. He then sexually assaulted her. When he was done, he went into the bedroom of the woman's 6-year-old daughter and he sexually assaulted her as well. After he was done, he fell asleep and the woman was able to free herself from her binds. She picked up her daughters and got out of the apartment. She then called 911 and the police arrived minutes later. They found Williams asleep in the woman's apartment and he was promptly arrested. For the 2 sexual assaults, Williams was sentenced to 17 years in prison and he ended up serving 12 years. After Williams was released from prison, he moved back to Gary, Indiana. In 1998, he was arrested again. This time it was for sexually abusing his 13-year-old nephew. He served 4 years in prison for that crime. He was arrested for the murder of Ricky about a year after he was paroled. In early 2005, Williams went to trial for Ricky's murder. In court, several witnesses testified that they saw Williams at a roller rink where Ricky and her sister were known to frequent. This is where it's believed that Ricky and Williams crossed paths. It is thought that on the night that Ricky was killed, Williams called her and lured her outside. He then kidnapped her, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and then dumped her body. Williams' lawyer said that Williams and Ricky had consensual sex before she died, and that's how his DNA ended up in her underwear. His lawyer then went on to say that there was no evidence that Williams killed Ricky. The jury ultimately found George Williams Jr. guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Since Williams was incarcerated starting a week after Ricky's murder, he could not have been the person who harassed and stalked Ricky's family in the 10 years after her murder. But who that person was and why he chose to torment Ricky Blake's family is still unknown. Number 2. Carol Ann Jackson and Janet Brown. Carol Ann Jackson lived alone in an isolated cottage in Woodburn Green, Buckinghamshire, England. The 50-year-old ran an antique shop out of her home. On April 13, 1997, neighbors of Jackson had not seen her in 2 days, so they went to her house to check on her. They found her dead body inside her home, and they called the police. The medical examiner determined that 2 days before her body was found, Jackson had been hit in the head several times with a blunt object. The medical examiner was not able to determine what that object was. The cause of death was asphyxiation, but there were no marks on her neck. So she may have been smothered with something like a pillow, or she could have been left unconscious face down on the floor, and she suffocated that way. Jackson's wrists and ankles were bound. There were no signs of sexual assault. One theory that the police had regarding the murder was that she was killed by an opportunist thief. On April 11th, the day that Jackson was killed, she was visiting a friend who lived about 40 miles from her own home. On her way home, Jackson stopped at an ATM and she withdrew £500. The police think that someone saw her withdraw the money and they followed her home. When she got home, she went inside and called her friend to tell her that she had arrived home safely. After hanging up, she went back to her car and started to collect items to bring inside. She was attacked there and she was forced back inside her home. She was then bound and assaulted by the killer. The police thought that the killer might have tortured Jackson in an effort to get her to explain how to get into her safe, where there was some jewelry. The killer ended up stealing the £500 and a Rolex that Jackson was wearing, but it's not believed that he got into the safe. However, not everyone is convinced that Jackson was killed by someone who happened to see her withdraw money at an ATM. They think she may have been killed by someone who had been stalking her for a couple of months. In February, about 2 months before the murder, Jackson was driving home and she was sure that someone was following her. She called her neighbor and he was outside her house waiting for her when she got home. He didn't see anyone following her, but Jackson was pretty frightened. She ended up calling the police and reporting the incident. Several weeks later, Jackson was out running some errands, and when she arrived home, she saw a man standing outside of her house. She called the police, and they brought search dogs, but they couldn't find anything of interest. Jackson was concerned about her safety, and she had a home security system. One amazing aspect about the murder is the timing. When Jackson arrived home after visiting her friend, she turned off the security system and called her friend. Jackson probably would have turned the alarm back on while she was home alone, but since she was going back to her car to retrieve some items, she didn't reactivate the alarm. In this tiny window of time, she was attacked and killed. It's possible that an opportunist thief may have just gotten lucky. Or it's possible that someone who was stalking her saw this as their best opportunity to attack her. Unfortunately, since there has never been an arrest, it's not known if either theory is true. Both the police and the media saw a connection between Carol Ann Jackson's murder and a murder that happened 2 years earlier to the day that Jackson was killed. Janet Brown lived in a large farmhouse in Radnage, Buckinghamshire, about 20 miles from where Carol Ann Jackson lived. She and her family had purchased the house in the mid-1980s. Like Jackson's house, the Browns' home was quite isolated. Their closest neighbors were several hundred feet away. A few years after they moved in, there was a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood, so Janet set up a neighborhood watch. She also had a security system installed in her house, and she bought a Great Dane. In the spring of 1995, Janet and her husband, Graham, put their house up for sale. They were planning on moving to Canada. On the morning of April 12, 1995, a contractor and his son arrived at the house to do some work. As they approached the house, they noticed that an alarm was ringing. The lights were on in the house, and there was 2 cars parked in the driveway. The contractor and his son knocked on the front door, but no one answered. They looked through a window, and they saw the naked body of 51-year-old Janet Brown lying at the bottom of the stairs. They went and called the police. Janet had been beaten in the back of the head with a blunt object. The medical examiner thought that she had been struck at least 10 times. The murder weapon wasn't found, but it was believed to have been a crowbar. Janet's hands were handcuffed behind her back. The keys to the handcuffs were found under her body. The medical examiner also determined that her ankles had been bound at some point. Brown packing tape had been wrapped around her head 9 times. The medical examiner said had she not been beaten to death, the tape would have caused her to asphyxiate to death. Although Janet was naked, the medical examiner did not find any signs of sexual assault. The police pieced together what they thought happened the day before Janet's body was found. Janet worked as a researcher at Oxford University's Department of Public Health and Primary Care. She went to work that day and came home to an empty house. Janet's husband, Graham, was a doctor, and he lived and worked in Switzerland. He came home once or twice a month for a day or two. Janet and Graham had 3 children, but only one lived at home. Their eldest daughter lived in London, and their only son was attending school in Exeter. Their youngest daughter, 17-year-old Roxanne, lived at home, but she was out that evening. She called home sometime that evening and told her mother that she was planning on sleeping over at her friend's house. A friend of Roxanne's called the Brown household at 8:10 p.m. and Janet answered. Then Graham called at 8:30 p.m. and there was no answer. The Browns had 2 alarm systems in their house. One is an external alarm which can be heard outside of the house. It would ring for 20 minutes, and then it would automatically turn off. The other alarm system was an internal alarm that was activated by 2 panic buttons. One panic button was in the master bedroom, and the other one was near the front door. The internal alarm could only be turned off by entering a code into a number pad. Unfortunately, Neither alarm was hooked up to a system that would contact a security firm or the police. At about 10:20 p.m. on the night that Janet was killed, someone driving by her house heard the external alarm. At the time, they did not know what the alarm was, and they didn't report hearing it until after they learned about the murder. When the contractor and his son found Janet's body, the internal alarm was ringing. The police thought that the killer broke in around 10 p.m., and this triggered the external alarm. The police thought that the killer got into the house through a double-pane glass patio door. He cut a hole in the exterior window, and he smashed the interior window. The police theorized that Janet heard the glass smashing, and she went to investigate. The intruder grabbed her, handcuffed her, wrapped tape around her head, and then he beat her to death. They ruled that the murder was a burglary gone wrong. But a forensic psychologist named Paul Britton, who advised on the case, did not agree with that conclusion. He thought that the killer had been stalking Janet and possibly her daughter Roxanne. When the killer broke into the house, there were two cars parked outside, Janet and Roxanne's. Also, there were lights on inside the house. So the intruder had to suspect that someone was in the home when he broke in. If his goal was just to rob a house, why would he choose a house where someone was home? Also, if he suspected that someone might be home, why did he smash the window? This would have made a lot of noise and attracted the attention of anyone inside. This is a terrible way to break into a random house to rob it. What if the resident was trained in martial arts or was armed with a weapon? The unexpected sound of a window breaking would usually prompt someone to grab anything that they could use as a weapon. If someone wanted to rob a house where someone was home, then they would want to be as stealth as possible. Another worry that criminals have when breaking into a home is if the resident has a dog, especially a vicious guard dog. The Browns did have a Great Dane, but it died 18 months before the murder. Britton says that all this suggests that the person who killed Janet was stalking her. When the killer broke in, he probably just assumed that Janet and Roxanne would be there. After all, both of their cars were in the driveway. He may have been surprised that Roxanne wasn't there when he broke in. Roxanne's friend had picked her up, and she had only decided to spend the night at her friend's house earlier that evening. Britton also doesn't believe that the killer got into the house through the patio door. Experienced burglars will often cut a hole in a pane of glass that is big enough for them to put their hand through. Then they reach through the hole and unlock the door or the window. Janet's killer didn't do that. The patio window was double paned. Instead of cutting a small hole his hand could fit through, he cut a large man-sized hole in the exterior patio window. As for the interior pane, he didn't cut a hole in it. Instead, he just smashed it. What was odd was that there seemed to be more glass outside than inside. This suggests that the pane of glass was smashed from the inside. Also, had the killer gotten in that way, he would have stepped on broken glass, and pieces of glass would have been embedded in the treads of his footwear. He would have then tracked shards and traces of glass throughout the house. But the police did not find any traces of broken glass anywhere else in the house. Another problem that Britton had with the crime scene is that if the killer broke in by smashing the patio window, and Janet was attacked when she went to investigate the noise, then why was she naked? If most people heard something like a window breaking while they were home alone and naked, they would put on some type of clothing and then go check the source of the noise. So Bryn thinks that the killer got in some other way and surprised Janet in her bedroom. He thinks that this happened sometime between 8:10 p.m. when Roxanne's friend called and Janet answered the phone, and 8:30 p.m. when Graham called and Janet didn't answer the phone. When the killer got to the master bedroom, Janet was either naked or he made her undress. Bryn said that even though Janet had not been sexually assaulted, it was still a sex crime. Bryn said he wanted to dominate her and feed off her fear. The killer probably had a fantasy he wanted to play out. The fantasy probably included handcuffing her and wrapping her head in tape. Bryn thought that Janet may have tried to run away, and this is how she ended up at the bottom of the stairs. The killer then ran after her and beat her in the head, probably with a crowbar. After killing Janet, he washed up and quite possibly showered. Bryn thinks it's highly possible that the killer brought a spare set of clothes and he changed into them after he washed himself. Bryn thinks this because there wasn't much blood found in other parts of the house. The only exceptions were watered-down bloodstains that were found on a light switch. Bryn also said that the killer was organized. Notably, he brought two types of tape with him. He used one type of tape when he cut a hole in the patio window, and he used a different tape to wrap around Janet's head. Neither roll of tape was in the house before the murder. He also brought the murder weapon with him, and he most likely brought a spare change of clothes with him. Bryn was also sure that the killer brought the handcuffs as well. The handcuffs were another clue that the murder was a sex crime and not a burglary gone wrong. The killer had two rolls of tape with him, but he bound her wrists with the handcuffs. Bryn thought that the handcuffs were part of a specific fantasy that the killer had. Bryn believes that the killer remained in the house for nearly 2 hours. He thinks it's possible that the killer may have been waiting for Roxanne to come home. Bryn doesn't believe that Janet activated either the internal or the external alarm. The internal alarm had to be activated by one of two panic buttons. If Janet activated the alarm, then she obviously did it before she was killed. But yet, the killer stayed in the house after the murder to wash up, and he may have even possibly showered. If the alarm was ringing, he probably wouldn't have stuck around to wash up. He probably wouldn't have known that the alarm just rang and didn't alert a security company. Nor could he have been sure that the alarm wouldn't attract the attention of a neighbor who could have called the police. Basically, it would have been too risky to stay behind and wash up while the alarm was ringing. As for the external alarm, it was heard after 10 o'clock, which is about 2 hours after it's believed that the killer broke into the house. The alarm would only ring for 20 minutes, and then it would stop. If the alarm had triggered while the killer was breaking in, it probably would have scared him away, because he had no idea who might hear it, or who the alarm might notify. So Bryn thinks the killer cut and smashed the patio windows after the murder, and this triggered the external alarm. He also triggered the internal alarm as he left. This would have made it look like a random home robbery gone wrong, when it was, in fact, a targeted sex crime committed by a stalker. Bryn says the final clue that the home invasion wasn't a robbery was the fact that nothing was stolen from the house and there had been no ransacking. Bryn didn't think that this was the only crime that the killer committed. Bryn suggested looking for similarities in other sex crimes that were committed in the area. The police did that, but it did not lead to an arrest. The police also eliminated all the usual suspects, like Janet's husband, because he was in Switzerland when she was killed. The police found no evidence that Janet was having an affair, so they are fairly certain that she wasn't killed by a boyfriend. In 2015, the police announced that they had developed a DNA profile of Janet Brown's killer. They conducted mass screenings and also compared it to 300 individual suspects. Unfortunately, they did not find a match. There are several similarities between the murders of Carol Ann Jackson and Janet Brown. First off, they were murdered 2 years to the day of each other. Jackson was killed on April 11, 1995, and Janet was killed on April 11, 1997. They were also close in age. Jackson was 50 years old, and Janet was 51 years old. They were both killed in their isolated houses, which were about 20 miles apart. Both were bound and struck in the head, but not sexually assaulted. Finally, both murders are unsolved. It's not known with any certainty if the two cases are connected, and this may not be answered until there is an arrest in at least one of the cases. Number 1. Kanika Powell. Kanika Powell was born on the last day of January 1981. She attended high school in Largo, Maryland. She graduated in 1998, and in 2000, she joined the Army. She ended up serving a tour of duty in Korea. Back stateside, she got a job with Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory as a security contractor. What she did for work was top secret, and she couldn't even explain her job to her mother. Her mother knew that her work somehow involved the military, and at times she had to travel to different cities to pick up items. On the evening of August 23, 2008, Powell was at home in her apartment in Prince George County, Maryland. At around 7 p.m., there was a knock at the door. She asked who was there, and the person who knocked on the door didn't say anything. Powell went and looked through her peephole, and she saw a man standing in front of her door. She asked him what he wanted, and he said he was with the FBI. He then held up what looked like an FBI shield in front of the peephole. He addressed Powell by her full name, and he said that he wanted to talk to her about an investigation. Powell thought that the FBI shield looked fake, so she asked for some photo ID and a warrant. Instead of providing either item, the man just walked away. She then went into her bedroom, and through her window, she saw the man walking away from her building. She thought she heard a second man yell at him to go in the opposite direction. The incident frightened Powell, so she called 911. The police arrived minutes later, and they searched the area, but they did not find anything of interest. Powell was so freaked out by the incident that she wrote the following email and sent it to friends and family. I just wanted to share with you the scariest thing that happened to me this weekend. Saturday evening around 7 p.m., a man was knocking at my door. As all of you may know, I live alone. I asked who it was and he didn't answer, so once I got close to the door and looked at the people, I saw a male figure that was not familiar to me at all. I asked who he was, and all he stated was that he was from the FBI and that he was looking for Kanika Powell. It freaked me out completely because this man knew my name. He held up a shield but no picture ID, and he never gave his name. He told me he was looking for me in regards to an investigation. I told him I had no idea as to what he was talking about, and that he would need to show me documentation as well as a warrant of some sort. So he left, and I looked out my bedroom window and saw him walking. I also heard a voice tell him to walk in the opposite direction. The whole situation was scary and seemed so false. So because of this incident, not only did I get no sleep for the rest of the weekend, but I am now trying to get an alarm system installed in my apartment. I had one in my old apartment, but I just hadn't had it transferred over to my new one. As far as everything that happened with the guy, I did call the FBI, and they told me that it was more than likely bogus, because they never come to your door by themselves, and they always leave a card of some sort so that you can contact them. I called the local police as well to give them a description, just in case someone is out there trying to rape or harm single women. Pass this on, ladies. This is not a fake forward. This happened to me, Kanika. Who knows who these guys are, and what they are doing, and in what areas other than mine. 4 days later, at around 7 p.m., someone knocked on Powell's apartment door. Powell asked who was there. The man said he had a package for Kanika Powell. Powell looked through her people and saw that it was a different man than the one who claimed to be the FBI agent. Powell didn't open the door, and the man said he was going to get her package from his vehicle. But he didn't return. He also didn't leave a note. About 12 hours later, sometime between 7 and 7:30 a.m., someone knocked on her door again. The man said that he was there to deliver a package. Once again, Powell didn't answer the door, and the man went away. Powell was disturbed by the incident, and she called her mother to talk about it. Powell thought it was strange that someone was delivering a package that early in the morning. Powell had to go out of town the next day for work, and she needed to run some errands for her trip out of town. She didn't feel comfortable running her errands after work because she didn't want to go out when it was dark. She decided to take the day off work, and that morning she went out and did her errands. Just before 11:50 a.m., Powell returned home. Someone was waiting for her in her hallway. He shot her multiple times in the torso with a handgun and then fled. A neighbor heard the gunshots and called 911. Powell was found unconscious on the floor in front of the door to her apartment. She was rushed to the hospital, but she never regained consciousness. 28-year-old Kanika Powell was pronounced dead the next day. The police investigated the usual suspects first, but it was a dead end. Powell wasn't dating anyone, she didn't have any disgruntled exes, nor did she have any problems with rejected admirers. Her friends and family couldn't think of anyone who would have wanted to hurt her. Powell's keys and her wallet were lying beside her when she was found unconscious, so robbery didn't seem to be the motive. There has been some speculation that Powell's murder was connected to her top-secret job. This theory was bolstered by something that happened about 2.5 months after her murder. Like Kanika Powell, 31-year-old Sean Nicholas Green had top-secret security clearance. He did tech support at the National Counterterrorism Center. He worked with computers that had sensitive national security information. Green was single, and he had never been married. He was close with his family, and he adored his 8 young nephews. Green lived a quiet life, and he referred to himself as a square. Like Powell, no one could think of why anyone would want to hurt Green. On November 12, 2008, Green was shot to death in his car as he was waiting at a red light. He was killed about 25 miles away from Powell's apartment. Like Powell, he had been shot multiple times in the torso with a handgun. While it wasn't made public how many times Powell was shot, Green was shot 9 times. Green's brother said that he went to the gym around the same time every day. He was killed at the time he usually drove to the gym. He was also killed on the route he took to the gym. So it's thought that the killer stalked him enough to know his routine. Another explanation is that Green wasn't targeted and his murder was just a random act of violence, or he may have been killed in a case of mistaken identity. Some people don't think that Green was randomly or accidentally murdered. They think that both Powell and Green were killed because of their work. But other people say that the connection is too loose. They both had top secret security clearance, but Powell and Green had completely different jobs and worked in different departments. Detectives who investigated Powell's murder don't think she was killed because of her work. One reason they believe this is because it doesn't seem like her murder was a professional hit. It's assumed that Powell was killed by one of the men who came to her door. By coming to her door multiple times, they could have exposed themselves. People could have seen them coming and going from the apartment. Green's murder seems more like a professional hit. He was killed while he was following his routine, and there were no witnesses. If Green thought he was being followed before he was killed, he didn't tell anyone. Since no arrest was made in either case, it's impossible to say with any certainty if the two murders are connected. Another theory about the murder of Kenneka Powell is that she was murdered by a serial killer. On the morning of June 24, 2008, the fire department was called to a house fire in Bowie, Maryland, which is in Prince George County. Inside the house, they found the dead body of 46-year-old Vilma Butler. Butler's death was not a result of the fire. Instead, she was shot in the torso, and then her house was torched. Butler's home was equipped with a sprinkler system, but it appeared to have been disabled before the fire was started. 2 months after Butler was killed, Kenneka Powell was shot multiple times in the torso outside of her apartment. 4 months after Powell's murder, at 2 a.m. on January 26, 2009, 16-year-old Carissa Lofton called 911. She whispered to the dispatcher that she needed help. She and her mother, 45-year-old Karen Lofton, had both been shot. First responders rushed to their home in Largo, Maryland, which is also in Prince George County. Sadly, they were too late. The mother and daughter were both dead by the time they arrived at their home. In the early morning hours of March 16, 2009, about a month after the Loftons were killed, the fire department was called to a vacant house in Logan. A stolen Nissan Maxima was on fire in the driveway. They put out the fire and discovered 2 bodies in the car. One was in the back seat, and the other was in the trunk of the car. The bodies were so severely burned that the fire department didn't even know what sex the victims were. The Nissan Maxima had been reported stolen just a few minutes before the fire department was called. Someone had broken into the owner's home and stolen the keys. While the owner of the car was on the phone with 911 reporting the robbery, she saw the car drive by, but she didn't get a good look at the driver. The next day, the police identified the bodies as 42-year-old Dolores DeWitt and her daughter, 19-year-old Ebony. Dolores and Ebony were reported missing shortly before their bodies were found. They were supposed to pick up a relative at the bus station, but they never did. The relative took a cab to their home and found the lights on, and their car was in the driveway. She called their cell phone several times, but they didn't answer. She got a bad feeling, so she reported them missing. It turned out that Dolores and Ebony had both been strangled to death. The police thought that the murders of Dolores and Ebony and Karen and Carissa were connected. Both sets of victims were mother and daughter. They lived within a mile of each other, and they were all killed in the early morning hours of a Monday. The police got their first lead in the murders several weeks later. The ATF was investigating the robbery of a gun store in Woodbine, Maryland. They learned from an informant that 27-year-old Jason Thomas Scott was involved in the robbery. Around the time of the murders, there had been a rash of break-ins and home invasions in Prince George County. When the police searched Scott's home, they found items that had been reported stolen from the break-ins and the home invasions. On a flash drive, they found photos of a teenage girl who had been sexually assaulted during one of the home invasions. Scott worked part-time at UPS. His job was to fix incorrect addresses on items that couldn't be delivered. The police checked the company's computer records. While Scott was working, someone had looked up the DeWitt's information on the computer. 2 other searches that were performed while Scott was working caught the interest of the police. Someone had looked up the address of Vilma Butler and the address of the home where the Nissan Maxima was stolen from. The police searched a vacant house where Scott hid his burglary tools and the clothes he wore when he broke into people's homes. In the vacant house, they found burned remnants of the DeWitt's clothes. Scott often committed his crimes with an accomplice. Earlier on the night that the DeWitts were killed, Scott and a partner robbed a house that was just down the street from the DeWitt's house. His partner said that after the robbery, he dropped off Scott near the DeWitt's house. The police found other evidence that connected Scott to the murder of the DeWitts, and he was indicted on their murders a few weeks after he was arrested. The police suspected that he murdered Vilma Butler and Karen and Carissa Lofton as well, but they couldn't find any evidence to connect him to those murders, so he wasn't charged. In September 2013, Scott entered an Alford plea for the murders of Dolores and Ebony DeWitt. When someone takes an Alford plea, they are not pleading guilty, but they acknowledge that if they went to trial, the district attorney would have enough evidence to convict them. Scott also confessed to 28 home robberies, 9 armed home invasions, and a gun store robbery. He also admitted to selling stolen guns on the street. In total, for all his crimes, he received 179 years in prison. Scott is considered a suspect in Kanika Powell's murder for several reasons. First, at least 2 men knocked on Powell's door, and she thought that the fake FBI agent had another man with him when he came to her apartment building. Scott worked with accomplices on several of his crimes. Secondly, Scott worked at UPS, and it's thought that he found out information about his victims by using their computers. When the men came to Powell's door, one thing that really freaked her out was that they knew her name. Using the UPS computer system, Scott could have found out Powell's name based on her address. Also, 2 times, a man claiming to deliver a package knocked on her door. Scott could have got the idea to use this ploy from his day job. Powell's murder also happened right in the midst of Scott's killing spree. She was killed 2 months after Vilma Butler was murdered, and 4 months before Karen and Chris Lofton were killed. Powell, like Butler and the Loftons, was shot with a handgun, and Scott had access to many guns. Scott has never confessed to being involved in Powell's murder, and no evidence connects him to the crime. At the time of this video, Kanika Powell's murder remains unsolved, and the case is considered cold. The police think that Jason Thomas Scott may be responsible for murders in places he visited, like Washington, D.C., Texas, and Florida. Thanks a lot for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it.
This revolutionary new device can remove up to 10 times more earwax than a traditional cotton swab.
Number 5. Renee Sweeney. On January 27, 1998, 23-year-old university student Renee Sweeney was working the day shift at the adults-only video store in Sudbury, Ontario. At 11:27 a.m., a young, white man who was wearing glasses and had short blonde hair walked into the store. He pulled out a knife and started to stab Sweeney in front of the store's counter. He then went to the washroom, probably to wash off Sweeney's blood. He came back out and found that Sweeney had crawled behind the counter where there was a phone. Determined to kill her, the man walked behind the counter and continued to stab her. Just after 11:30, 2 of Sweeney's friends came into the store. The killer pushed past them and walked out the door. Sweeney's friends found her body and called 911. Sweeney had been stabbed over 30 times, and she died as a result of her wounds. $200 was also taken from the register. When the police investigated the murder, they surmised that Sweeney may have been stalked before she was killed. In the days leading up to the murder, Sweeney had gotten a lot of phone calls that were hang-ups. Also, when she went to work, she used to park in the spot furthest from the store. However, in the days leading up to the murder, she parked as close to the store as she could. Her co-workers thought that this was very out of character for her. In one sense, the police were lucky because they were able to collect a lot of evidence from the murder scene. Besides the eyewitnesses who saw the killer and gave a description that resulted in this sketch, the killer also left behind fingerprints. Another set of clues was found a short distance away from the store. As he fled the scene, the killer discarded the jacket and a pair of white gardening gloves that he wore during the murder. The jacket is rather unique. It is a High Sierra windbreaker, and it was only sold by Mervyn's department stores in California between 1994 and 1995. In the left breast pocket of the jacket, there was a diaper pin. Finally, the police had the killer's DNA, which was taken from tissue that was found under Sweeney's fingernails. From the DNA, the police were able to develop this snapshot of the killer. This is what the killer would have looked like in 1998 when he was about 25 years old. One thing that the police noticed was how similar the sketch composed from the DNA profile looks compared to the sketch that was based on the eyewitnesses' descriptions. Despite all the evidence that they have, the police have not named a suspect, and the case is currently cold. Number 4. Cynthia Anderson. Starting in summer 1981, 20-year-old Cynthia Anderson started to get unsettling phone calls at her workplace, which was a law office in Toledo, Ohio. Anderson was so worried about the calls that her employers had an emergency buzzer installed at her desk. She also kept the doors to the office locked at all times. Anderson was also apparently plagued by horrible nightmares where she was being attacked by a mysterious man. On the morning of August 4th, 1981, Anderson was working alone in the office. Witnesses last saw Anderson around 9:45 a.m., but when people called the office at 10 a.m., there was no answer. When the lawyers arrived in the office after being in court in the morning, they found that the office was ready for the day, but Anderson was gone. Her car was in the parking lot, but her purse and keys were gone. She also didn't leave a note saying where she went, which is something she always did. Finally, there was a book open on her desk. It was open to a page where the main character is being violently kidnapped. The police do not think that Anderson chose to disappear. She had no personal problems, and she was looking forward to attending Bible college in the fall. Also, she left behind a large amount of money in her bank account, and her social security number has not been used since she went missing. There are several suspects in the case, including a set of serial killer brothers named Anthony and Nathaniel Cook. They were convicted of murdering 9 people in Ohio, but they have denied killing Anderson. Another theory is that a drug dealer and his attorney are responsible for her disappearance. The attorney worked at the same law firm where Anderson worked in 1981, and the theory is that Anderson overheard something that she shouldn't have heard. However, there's not much evidence to back up either theory, and no one has ever been charged in connection with Anderson's disappearance. Sadly, her body has never been found. Number 3. Mary Shotwell Little. In October 1965, 25-year-old Mary Shotwell Little was working at the CNS Bank in Atlanta, Georgia. On October 14th, she left work for the day and went and picked up some groceries for a party that she planned to throw the next day. Her husband of 6 weeks, Roy Little, had been away on a business trip, and she wanted to throw him a welcome home party. After getting the groceries, she put them in her car, and then she met a co-worker for dinner at a restaurant in the Lenox Square Shopping Center. At about 8 p.m., Mary and her co-worker parted ways. The next morning, Mary didn't show up for work, and she didn't call in. Mary's boss asked the co-worker who dined with her the night before if she knew Mary's whereabouts. After calling her at home and not getting an answer, they decided to phone the mall to see if Mary's car, a 1965 Mercury Comet, was still in the parking lot. The security guard checked, and the car wasn't in the lot. A few hours later, Mary's boss decided to drive to the mall, and there, in plain sight, was Mary's car, parked in the exact spot that Mary had parked it the night before. The police were notified, and they came to examine the car. There was a fine layer of red dust on the exterior of the car, as if it had been driven on a dirt road. Inside the car, they found the groceries that Mary had purchased in the back seat. On the console between the 2 seats were Mary's undergarments. They had recently been worn, and they were neatly folded. However, one stocking was missing. There was also a little bit of blood in the car, but no more than a common nosebleed. Finally, the Littles recorded their car usage in a mileage log. Using the log and the odometer, the police concluded that there were 41 miles unaccounted for. The first person of interest was Mary's husband Roy. Some of Mary's friends didn't like him, and supposedly he didn't seem to care that his wife was missing. He also refused to take a lie detector test multiple times. However, the police had no reason to suspect him. He had a solid alibi, there were no marital problems, and he had nothing to gain by killing his wife. Another suspect in the disappearance is a person who was stalking Mary before she went missing. In the weeks leading up to Mary's disappearance, she was getting strange phone calls at work. Mary told the unidentified caller that she was married and could no longer go over to the caller's house, but the caller could visit Mary at her house if he or she wanted to. Mary also received a bouquet of roses from someone who only identified themselves as a secret admirer. The police went to the flower shop, which wasn't far from Mary's house, but they couldn't identify the person who ordered the flowers. Finally, several of Mary's friends said that in the weeks before she went missing, she was afraid to be alone. She didn't like to be home alone, and she didn't like to drive alone. However, she never told anyone why she was afraid to be by herself. A month later, Mary still hadn't been found, but the police did uncover a strange clue. In the early morning hours on the day after Mary went missing, her credit card was used to buy gas at a 24-hour gas station in her hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina, which is about a 4-hour drive from Atlanta. 12 hours later, her credit card was used again to purchase gas. This time it was in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is about 2.5 hours away from Charlotte, heading away from Atlanta. The receipts were checked and both of them were signed by Mary, and it appears to be her handwriting. The police interviewed the gas station attendants at both stores. The employee in Charlotte said that he remembered the woman who signed for the gas because she had a cut on her forehead and she was trying to hide her face. She was with a man and it looked like he was giving her orders. The attendant at the Raleigh gas station said that the woman who signed the receipt had blood on her and she was with 2 men. Neither gas station attendant could remember what type of car she was traveling in, but there was a record of the license plate, but it turned out that the license plate was stolen off a car in Charlotte. Those were the last sightings of Mary, and her body has never been found. What the police believe happened was that Mary was grabbed by someone in the parking lot of the Lenox Shopping Center. The kidnapper drove Mary away in her car, and then they changed vehicles. Mary and her kidnapper then drove to Charlotte, where she was possibly held for 10 hours. While she was being held in Charlotte, an accomplice returned Mary's car to the parking lot in the Lenox Shopping Center, where she had parked the car the night before. Then the kidnapper and possibly his accomplice drove with Mary to Raleigh. An FBI agent who worked on the case thinks that Mary's body is buried somewhere north of Raleigh. If the theory is true, it only adds more questions instead of clearing anything up. For example, why would the kidnapper have the car returned in broad daylight to such a public place where the victim was last seen? Why would the kidnapper take Mary to her hometown where there is a better chance of her being recognized? Also, why did he make her pay for gas at the 2 gas stations instead of hiding her in the car? Why not pay in cash? Why start a paper trail by forcing your kidnapped victim to use her credit card? All these steps seem risky, and it would have only drawn more attention to the kidnapping. However, despite these odd steps taken by the kidnapper, or kidnappers, he or they have never been identified. One last thing to note about this case is that a co-worker of Mary's was murdered 18 months after Mary disappeared. Diane Shields was last seen leaving work in May 1967, and later that night her body was found in the trunk of her car. She suffocated to death after someone shoved a scarf down her throat. It's unclear if the 2 cases are connected. However, some investigators find it odd that 2 young women who worked at the same bank went missing and were murdered within 18 months of each other. Just like Mary's disappearance, the murder of Diane Shields is currently unsolved. Number 2. Dorothy Jane Scott. In early 1980, 32-year-old single mother Dorothy Jane Scott of Anaheim, California, was having a problem with a stalker. The man would call her at work, and she said that the voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Sometimes the caller would be nice, but other times he'd be violent and menacing. He also said that he was following her. To prove that he wasn't joking, he told Dorothy some personal details about herself. The calls unnerved Dorothy, and she even took self-defense classes. On the evening of May 28, 1980, Dorothy dropped off her son at her parents' house and then went to a staff meeting at her work, which was a head shop across the road from Disneyland. At the meeting, she noticed that her co-worker, Conrad Bostron, was not looking well. Specifically, his arm had become red and swollen. Dorothy drove Bostron and another co-worker, Pamela Head, to the UC Irvine Medical Center. It turned out that Bostron had been bitten by a black widow spider. When Bostron was released from the hospital, Head stayed with him while he signed some papers, and Dorothy went to bring the car up to the hospital's entrance. When Head and Bostron walked out of the hospital, they waited for a few minutes before they saw Dorothy's car speed towards them, but it didn't stop. Instead, it turned right out of the parking lot and drove off into the night. At first, Bostron and Head thought that Dorothy must have had some type of emergency with her son and had to leave, so they waited 2 hours at the hospital, and when they realized that she wasn't coming back, they called her parents, but her parents hadn't heard from her. The police were notified, and a few hours later, Dorothy's car was found engulfed in flames in an alley a few miles from the hospital. For some reason, the police did not want the Scott family to discuss the case with the media. The Scotts agreed, but about a week after Dorothy's disappearance, her mother, Vera, received a disturbing phone call. The caller asked, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" Vera replied yes, and the caller said, "I've got her." and then he hung up the phone. 2 weeks after Dorothy went missing, her father spoke to a reporter at a local newspaper. On the day that the story appeared in the newspaper, the editor received a call from a man who said, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The caller also described what she was wearing on the day that she went missing, and he even told the editor why Dorothy was at the hospital on the night that she disappeared. The caller continued to harass the family for the next 4 years. The calls came on Wednesdays, which was the day of the week that Dorothy disappeared. Usually they came during the day when Vera was home alone. The caller would sometimes say that he killed Dorothy, or other times he would say that he had her. Or he would call and ask, "Is Dorothy there?" The police tried to trace the calls, but the kidnapper never stayed on the line long enough. In April 1984, the caller took a break from harassing the family, but then months later, in August, a construction worker in North Anaheim was doing some digging when he came across the skeleton of a dog. Buried under the dog bones were human remains. The remains were identified a week later as Dorothy Jane Scott. Also in the grave was Dorothy's watch, which had stopped at 12:30 a.m., May 29, 1980, which is about an hour after she was last seen at the hospital. The killer may have buried Dorothy under the dog to throw off police searches. If the police used cadaver dogs and they found a dead dog, they may have just assumed that the dog smelled the remains of the dead dog and might not have dug any deeper, effectively hiding Dorothy's remains. Dorothy did not have a dog with her when she went missing, and the police have no idea where the killer got the dog from. After the body was found, the killer called the family again. When her parents were out planning her funeral, her brother got 2 calls. Both times the man asked, "Is Dorothy there?" The calls finally came to an end after that. The police are sure that the man who stalked Dorothy is responsible for her murder, and he is also the same man that harassed the family while she was missing. Unfortunately, he has never been identified. Number 1. Danny Barter. On June 18, 1959, 4-year-old Danny Barter was camping with 6 other family members on the banks of Perdido Bay, which is about an hour away from their home in Mobile. Sometime between 9:30 and 10 a.m., Danny went missing. He was barefoot and only wearing shorts. He was also drinking a knee-high soft drink. The area was searched, but Danny couldn't be found. The initial theory from the police was that Danny was attacked by an animal. The area where the family was camping had alligators and snakes nearby. 2 alligators were gutted, but their stomach didn't contain any human remains. In fact, there was no trace of the 4-year-old boy anywhere in the area. Not even his soft drink bottle was found. Since there was no trace of Danny, the family and the police concluded that he was most likely kidnapped. Quite possibly, he was kidnapped by someone who had been stalking the family for about a month. Danny's mother, Maxine Barter, first noticed a man sitting in a car watching their house about a month before the family went camping. When Maxine went to confront the man, he hid his face behind a newspaper and then drove away. A few weeks later, the neighbors spotted a man looking through a window into the bedroom where Danny and his brother slept. The neighbors went to confront the man, but he ran away. However, he did leave behind a clue. Under the window, in the mud, was a pair of footprints. The sheriff's office was called, and caster molds of the footprints were made. Finally, the day before Danny went missing, Maxine and her sons drove to a store. Maxine left the boys in the car while she ran inside the store. When she left the car, a man pulled up beside the Barter's car, and he watched the boys for a few minutes without saying a word, and then he drove away before Maxine came back out. Sadly, it's been nearly 60 years since Danny disappeared, and he has never been found. His family is still looking for answers as to what happened to him. Thanks for watching.
No-code tools allow us to create impactful.
Before today's video, we want to bring you a word from AppZone, who is a regular sponsor of this channel. AppZone is an app that suggests games to play. Dana Chisholm. Dana Chisholm was born in August 1969 in Rock Hill, South Carolina. She was a decent student, and in high school, she was a cheerleader. Like a lot of teenagers, Dana experimented with drugs, and at one point, she ran away from home. She eventually straightened out her life, and she went to college to study business. After college, in 1993, Dana moved to Washington, D.C., and just over a year later, she got a job as a secretary at a think tank. Dana's real dream was to be a singer. Her friends and family said that she sang like Whitney Houston. Just after 1 a.m. on February 27, 1995, Dana's parents, who lived in Rock Hill, received a strange phone call. The caller said that he was Lieutenant Lewis Douglas from the Metropolitan Police Department, and he said that Dana had been arrested for prostitution. The caller said that Dana was really upset, and she didn't want him to call her parents. The caller gave her parents a phone number where he could be reached, and then he ended the call. Dana's father thought that the caller didn't speak like a police officer. He sounded edgy. He spoke fast and very loudly. Dana's parents tried to get a hold of her later that day, but they were unable to. They decided to call back Lieutenant Lewis Douglas. When he answered the phone, Dana's father was shocked because Douglas had a different voice than the man who originally called them. Dana's father asked about his daughter, and Lieutenant Douglas said that he didn't call them. Of course, this only made Dana's father more confused, and Douglas didn't understand what was going on either. Douglas wasn't sure how the caller knew his office phone number. What was odd was that Douglas knew who Dana Chisholm was because he had been at her apartment weeks earlier. He was there because someone had stolen her television. So Dana's father asked Douglas to go check on her. Douglas drove over to Dana's basement apartment, which was in one of the safest neighborhoods in DC. Her neighbor was the former director of the FBI. Douglas knocked on her door, and he heard no movement inside. He left his business card at her front door. Dana's parents continued to try and get in contact with her, but they couldn't. At around 6 p.m., a friend of Dana's called her landlord because she didn't come into work that day. Her landlord ended up calling the police. Dana's body was found in her apartment. She had been strangled to death with a cord. The medical examiner estimated that the time of death was about 9 p.m. the day before she was found. Her apartment showed no signs of a break-in or forced entry. Not far from the apartment, a reporter found a key to the apartment. The police aren't sure if it was a key that Dana had given someone or if it was a spare key that Dana had hidden somewhere outside of her apartment. The apartment had been ransacked. It's believed that while the killer was ransacking the apartment, he found Lieutenant Douglas's business card. Then about 4 hours after he killed Dana, he called her parents posing as Douglas. On the back door of the apartment, the police found a note that read, "I'll be back," and then there were the initials, MPD. The lead detective on the case, Michael Farish, thought that the initials meant Metropolitan Police Department. The note was not left there by Lieutenant Douglas when he came to check on Dana. This note was found at the back door, and Douglas left his business card at the front door. Farish began to investigate Dana's private life. Since moving to DC, she had dated several men, and she was working as an escort. She would go on dates with the men, and then tell them that she needed money to pay her bills and her rent. It also turned out that Dana was 4 weeks pregnant. She had told a friend at work about the pregnancy, and when her parents had talked to her last, which was about a week before she was killed, Dana said that she planned on coming home to tell them some big news. Not long after the murder, a man with a raspy voice called the homicide division looking for Farish. He said that he wanted to talk about Dana Chisholm's murder. The first few times he called, Farish wasn't at his desk. The man left messages for Farish, telling him that he should phone him back, but the caller would never leave a callback number. A few weeks after the murder, Farish was at his desk when the man called. The caller said that he knew why Dana was killed. He said it was because of her lifestyle. He said that she went out to clubs, she drank, and she had sex with many men. The caller was adamant that Farish should share those details with the reporters who were covering the story. Farish ended up doing the opposite. He told the reporters that Dana was a naive young woman. Farish was hoping that by going against the caller's demands, it would force him to call again and possibly expose his identity. Not long after Farish's comments were published, Farish got another call from the man with the raspy voice. He was angry that Farish didn't tell the reporters the truth. Over the next 2 months, the man with the raspy voice called him twice more. Both conversations were short and testy. On the last call, the man told Farish that they should meet. He told Farish to meet him at a place just east of the river. Farish went to the area and waited for several hours, but the man with the raspy voice never showed up. Farish hopes that one day the man with the raspy voice will call him again. Or even better, he'll turn himself in. At the time of this video, the murder of Dana Chisholm is considered cold. Number 1. Susan Eads. At the end of August 1983, 19-year-old Susan Eads was working 2 waitressing jobs at bars near NASA Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. When she could get the gig, she worked as a DJ. On August 30th, 1983, Susan was working at a bar called Jason's Club in Webster, Texas. At the end of her shift, she left the bar alone. The next morning, her body was found hidden behind a bush in an empty lot that was a couple miles from the bar. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death with the jumpsuit that she was wearing. Her car was found close by in the parking lot of a business that sold boats. Her purse, her high school class ring, and her gold necklace were missing. The police interviewed people who were at the bar the last time that Eads was seen alive. They said that a man asked her to dance, and she turned him down. No one at the bar knew who the man was, but they gave a description that resulted in this sketch. One big problem is that the police have no idea if the man was involved in the murder because Susan left the bar alone that night. Shortly after the murder, Susan's mother, Shirley, who lived in Seabrook, Texas, started to receive strange phone calls. At first, the caller would just hang up after she answered. Then the caller started talking to Shirley. He identified himself as Bill, and he said he lived on Telephone Road in Houston, which is an actual road in Houston. Shirley got in touch with the police, and they recorded some of the phone calls. These clips, which were made public in 2018, are from the actual phone calls.
Hello? Hello? You said you knew Susan. Well, I still can't believe that I never knew of you. I don't understand that.
Some people have secrets, they like to keep themselves.
You have some pictures of her, you told me. I'd like to see them.
Just you, I ain't gonna show them to anyone else.
Would you want me to meet you somewhere?
My place or a motel or something like that.
Where'd you say? Houston?
Here's some photos.
Unfortunately, the caller never stayed on the line long enough for the police to trace where the calls were coming from. The police are hoping that someone will recognize the voice. If the voice is identified, it could also help solve several other murders. Susan's body was found about 10 miles away from one of the most infamous dumping grounds for bodies, the Texas Killing Fields. The field is named the Calder Oil Field, and it's 25 acres of land inside the city limits of League City, Texas, which is south of Houston and north of Galveston. The field is close to Interstate 45, which is marked with a red line on this map. Since 1971, dozens of women and girls who live near the field in Interstate 45 have been murdered or have gone missing. The police think that at least 4 serial killers were active in the area between 1971 to the early 2000s. It's possible that Susan was a victim of one of these serial killers, or her murder may have just been a one-off. The first known victim associated with the Texas killing fields is 13-year-old Colette Wilson. On June 17, 1971, her band instructor dropped her off on a street corner in Manville, Texas. When her mother pulled up to the corner 6 minutes later to pick her up, she was gone. 15 days later, 14-year-old Brenda Jones disappeared from Galveston. Her body was found floating in the water the next day near Pelican Island, which is part of the city of Galveston. The cause of death was manual strangulation. A month later, on August 4, 1971, two 14-year-old girls, Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw, vanished after spending the afternoon at a beach in Galveston. 2 months later, on August 28, 19-year-old Gloria Gonzalez disappeared from Houston. On November 3rd, about a week after Gloria Gonzalez disappeared, 16-year-old Adele Crabtree left the hippie commune where she was living in Houston to hitchhike to work. Hours later, another young woman went missing. 21-year-old Linda Faye Sutherland was last seen leaving a bar on Telephone Road at 12:30 a.m. on November 4th. Telephone Road is the same road that Bill, the mysterious caller, told Susan Eads' mother he lived on. Hours after Sutherland was last seen alive, the body of Adele Crabtree was found near Conroe, Texas. She was fully clothed, and she had been shot twice with a shotgun. On November 7th, the body of Linda Faye Sutherland was found in a ditch a few miles from where she was last seen. She had been strangled, but that wasn't the cause of death. She had been shot with a shotgun, and she had 72 bullet wounds in her back, shoulders, and legs. 2 weeks after that, the mother of 12-year-old Allison Craven, who lived in Houston, reported her missing. Her mother had left her home alone while she ran out to do some errands. When she came home, Allison wasn't there, and the contents of Allison's purse were strewn about the home. 6 days later, on November 15, 1971, two 15-year-old girls, Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, went missing while hitchhiking in Galveston. 2 days later, their partially nude bodies were found floating in Turner's Bayou, about 10 miles away from where they were last seen. Both had been shot in the head twice. On November 26, 1971, less than a week after Debbie and Maria's bodies were found, the body of 19-year-old Gloria Gonzalez was found. Gonzalez vanished 6 days before Debbie and Maria went missing. Her body was found near the Addicks Reservoir, which is in West Houston. During the autopsy, the medical examiner discovered that a tooth that was recovered from the dump site didn't belong to Gonzalez. He thought the tooth must have come from another body that was dumped nearby, so he suggested a larger search of the area. 3 days after Gonzalez's body was found, the remains of the first victim, Colette Wilson, were found not far from Gonzalez's remains. Her head was missing. It was found 4 days later, not far from the rest of her remains. It had probably been moved by animals. The medical examiner concluded that Colette probably died from blunt force trauma to the head, while Gonzalez had probably been strangled to death. By the time 1971 came to an end, 10 young women had disappeared between Houston and Galveston. Only 7 other bodies had been found. Just 3 days into 1972, the bodies of Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw, who went missing 5 months earlier, were found. Sharon's skull was found in Clear Lake, which is just north of Lake City and south of Houston. The rest of her remains, and the remains of Rhonda, were found in a nearby marshland. They had been bound and shot to death. Around the same time that their remains were found, some of 12-year-old Allison Craven's remains were found in a field not far from her home. A month later, the rest of her remains were found dumped in a field of hairland about 10 miles away from where she went missing. The string of murders of teenage girls shocked the people of Greater Houston and Galveston County, and understandably, people were afraid. Their panic started to subside in the spring of 1972 when several arrests were made. It started in April when 25-year-old Henry Lanham was charged with murdering Linda Sutherland, the seventh young woman to go missing. Lanham had a criminal record that included a conviction for sexual assault. On the night that Sutherland went missing, Lanham was seen talking to her at the bar. The police originally tried to interview Lanham months earlier about the murder, but he refused to cooperate. So the police kept him under constant surveillance, and the stress apparently got to be too much for him. In April 1972, after months of constant surveillance, he supposedly confessed, but he said that he wasn't the person who physically shot Sutherland. He said he was just present at the murder. He said that 22-year-old Anthony Michael Nopa was the person who shot Sutherland. Nopa was arrested, and in June 1972, he supposedly confessed to shooting Sutherland. Around the same time that Nopa confessed, Lanham also apparently confessed to the murders of Colette Wilson, Gloria Gonzalez, and Adele Crabtree. Both men went to trial in October 1972 for the murder of Linda Faye Sutherland. They both testified that they were coerced into making the confessions, and they swore that they were innocent. Nopa said that an officer threatened to shoot him if he didn't confess, and then the officer said he was going to cover up the shooting by making it look like Nopa was trying to escape. Both Lanham and Nopa were found guilty. Nopa was given a sentence of 50 years in prison, and Lanham was sentenced to 25 years in prison. As 1972 was coming to an end, Lanham was being held in the Harris County Jail, awaiting his trial for the murders of Colette Wilson and Gloria Gonzalez. But he would never face those charges. On December 30th, 1972, Lanham was shot to death during an apparent escape attempt. In May 1972, a month after Nopa and Lanham were arrested, there was an arrest in the murder of 12-year-old Allison Craven. 22-year-old Henry Doyle Shufflin, a Vietnam vet with a history of mental illness, apparently confessed to the murder. In October 1973, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. 2 years later, Shufflin filed an appeal. He said he was innocent and that the confession and the guilty plea were both coerced. He said he only agreed to plead guilty because the judge on the case implied that he would get early parole if he pleaded guilty. Shufflin said that the judge even showed him a letter that he had written recommending that Shufflin should get early parole if he pleaded guilty. Shufflin's appeal was ultimately denied. Finally, in June 1972, about a month after Shufflin was arrested, the police in Webster, Texas, made an arrest. 24-year-old Michael Lloyd Self was charged with the murder of 14-year-old Sharon Shaw, but not with the murder of 14-year-old Rhonda Johnson, who was murdered at the same time as Sharon. They were the third and fourth girls to go missing. It was done this way because if the district attorney failed to convict Self of Sharon's murder, then they could have had him charged with Rhonda's murder. Self, who worked as a gas station attendant, has first run in with the law in 1970 when he was arrested for a peeping Tom incident. He wasn't given jail time over the incident. Instead, he was ordered to receive psychiatric treatment. Self then found himself on the radar of Michael Morris, who had recently become chief of police in Webster. Morris first encountered Self when he was investigating the theft of some gas from the fire chief's station wagon. In June 1972, Morris brought Self into the police station to interview him about the murders of Sharon Shaw and Rhonda Johnson. After a few hours, Self supposedly confessed to the murders, and he signed the confession. However, just like Lanham, Nopa, and Shufflin, Self swore that the confession was coerced and that he was innocent. He claimed that Morris threatened to beat him with a nightstick. When that threat didn't work, Self said that Morris took out his revolver, removed all the bullets but one, and then spun the cylinder. Self said that Morris held a gun to his head and told him to confess. When he didn't, Morris pulled the trigger. Luckily, there was no bullet in that chamber, but the game of Russian roulette convinced Self to confess. At Self's trial, his lawyer pointed out that his confession was full of inaccuracies. For example, he said he dumped the bodies 20 miles away from where they were found. He also said that he beat the girls on the head with a Coke bottle, but the medical examiner determined that they didn't suffer any head injuries. Finally, Self confessed that he took their clothes with him, but their clothes were found with their remains. Self was found guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. 2 years after Self was convicted, there was another arrest. The person who was arrested was Michael Morris, the former chief of police in Webster, who was responsible for putting Self in prison. Morris and the former assistant police chief in Webster were arrested by a posse of citizens in Caddo Mills, Texas, after they robbed a bank. It turned out that Morris, along with the former assistant police chief and a third man, had been involved in a string of bank robberies around Texas that started in 1972. Morris was convicted of the bank robberies, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The problem was that even with the 3 men in prison and 1 dead, the killings didn't stop. On October 20th, 1972, which was the same day that Lanham and Nopa were convicted, 15-year-old Mildred Joanne Knighton vanished from Pasadena, Texas. Her body was found in an industrial area of Pasadena 3 days later. She had been stabbed 61 times in the back, 9 times in the face, and her throat had been slashed nearly to the point of decapitation. On January 3, 1973, 16-year-old Kimberly Pitchford attended a driver's ed class at a high school in Houston. The class ended at 6 p.m., and she was supposed to call home for a ride. She never called, and she never came home. Her body was found 2 days later under a bridge in a canal about 25 miles away from where she was last seen. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. On September 6, 1974, about 20 months after Kimberly Pitchford was killed, 14-year-old Georgia Greer and 12-year-old Brooks Bracewell vanished as they walked to school in Dickinson, Texas. The police told the girls' parents that the girls had probably just run away and they would most likely return at any time. 13 months later, the girls still had not returned home, and another teenage girl disappeared. On October 22, 1975, 16-year-old Nina Lynn Klug watched Game 7 of the World Series at a friend's home in Rocheron, Texas, and then she left on her own to drive to her home in Cypress, Texas. Sadly, she never made it there. Her car, which had a dead battery, was found on the shoulder of Highway 6 near Arcola. Her nude body was found in a ditch lying on a pile of clothes close to Rocheron on Thanksgiving Day, which was about a month after she went missing. A year and a half after 14-year-old Georgia Greer and 12-year-old Brooks Bracewell vanished, their skulls were found near Alvin, Texas, not too far from where Colette Wilson, the first victim, was last seen alive. Both of their skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma. The rest of their remains were not with their skulls. Nearly a year after the skulls of the 2 girls were found, on May 21, 1977, 12-year-old Suzanne Bowers walked out of her grandparents' home in Galveston. She planned to walk the mile to her home, get her bike, and then meet her friends at the beach. She never made it to the beach, and when she didn't return home that evening, her parents reported her missing. Her body was found nearly 2 years to the day that she went missing in Santa Fe, Texas, which is about 20 miles away from where she was last seen. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. A month before Suzanne's body was found, 12-year-old Angela Desiree Kelly, who lived in Pasadena, was found murdered not far from her home. Her hands had been tied behind her back, and she had been strangled to death. The summer of 1979 nearly ended without another murder, but then a 12-year-old went missing from Conroe, Texas. On September 7, 1979, Lecia Michelle Jackson was swimming with her brothers at a public pool, and then she left the pool to walk home without them. Her body was found 6 days later in an oil field, about 17 miles away from where she was last seen. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. As the 1970s ended, the murder seemed to come to an end as well. Then on July 1st, 1982, 22-year-old Tamara Ellen McCurry disappeared from Galveston. She was last seen getting into a strange van. Her body has never been found. 14 months later, Susan Eads was murdered. She was the 20th young woman or girl to go missing or to be murdered in the area since 1971. Another 14 months went by without another murder or disappearance. Then on December 10th, 1983, 23-year-old Heidi Villarreal Fife disappeared after visiting a convenience store in League City. 16 days later, 14-year-old Sandra Ramber's mother made an odd discovery when she arrived home. The front door of their house in Santa Fe was open and biscuits were baking in the oven, but there was no sign of Sandra. Sadly, Sandra's body has never been found. In April 1984, the remains of Heidi Villarreal Fife were found in the oil field on Calder Road, which is known as the Texas Killing Fields. Months later, on July 29, 1984, 29-year-old Ellen Rae Beeson went missing after spending the evening at a nightclub in Lake City. In September 1984, a couple of months after Ellen Rae Beeson went missing, 16-year-old Laura Miller disappeared. She was last seen at the same convenience store in Lake City where Heidi Villarreal Fife was last seen 11 months earlier. Then in July 1985, there was a strange twist in the disappearance of 29-year-old Ellen Rae Beeson, who went missing a year earlier after visiting a nightclub in Lake City. A woman named Candy Gifford, who was a friend of Beeson's and was with her at the bar on the last night that she was seen alive, went to the police with an unusual story. Gifford said that when she left the bar, she noticed that Beeson was talking to Clyde Edward Hedrick. Over the next several months, anytime that Gifford saw Hendrick, she asked him what happened to Beeson. Hedrick kept brushing off Gifford, then he finally decided to show her what happened to her friend. He took her to the Galveston Causeway, and under an abandoned couch was Beeson's body. Hedrick said that after the bar that night, he and Beeson went skinny dipping, and she drowned. He didn't think that anyone would believe that her death was an accident, so he hid her body under the couch. Hedrick told Gifford not to tell anyone about the body, or he would kill her and her family. Gifford didn't say anything to anyone for a few months, but then in July 1985, she told the police. Hedrick was arrested, and he told the police that Beeson had drowned. They couldn't find any evidence to the contrary, so he was charged and then convicted of abuse of a corpse. He served a year in prison for the conviction. On October 5, 1985, 17-year-old Michelle Doherty Thomas left her home in Santa Fe with 2 male friends. She didn't return home that evening, and 2 days later, her family filed a missing persons report. The police interviewed Michelle's friends that she was last seen with. The friends said that they were going out to a bar, but they stopped at a convenience store first. At the convenience store, Michelle supposedly got into a different man's car, and that was the last time they saw her. They later changed their story and said that when they were stopped at an intersection, a man forced Michelle to get out of their car and into his, and that was the last time they saw her. The police tracked down the man who supposedly kidnapped Michelle, and he was charged with her murder. However, those charges were eventually dropped. Michelle's body has never been found, and it's unknown if her disappearance is connected to the Rasha murders or if her disappearance is just a one-off. On February 2, 1986, the remains of a woman were found in the oil field on Calder Road. The remains have never been identified, and she is simply called Jane Doe. It's believed that she was about 25 years old. She was 5'5" and weighed about 140 pounds. She had shoulder-length, reddish-brown hair. She had been shot in the back, and she had been in the field anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months before she was found. Her body was found about 200 feet from where Heidi Villarreal Feist's remains were found nearly 2 years earlier. The day after Jane Doe was found, about 50 feet from her body, the police found the body of Laura Miller, who went missing a year and a half earlier. Due to the condition of her body, a cause of death couldn't be determined. After the discovery of the 16-year-old's body, the area between Houston and Galveston was quiet yet again. By the autumn of 1988, it had been 3 years since a young woman went missing. On October 7, 1988, 22-year-old Suzanne Renee Richardson was working an overnight shift as a desk clerk at a condominium resort community in Galveston. She was last seen at 6 a.m. in the condominium's office by a security guard. Shortly after 6 a.m., an employee sleeping above the office heard a scream, then the sound of a car door slamming, and then a car speeding off. When a guest arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., the office was empty, and there was no sign of where Richardson went. What happened to her is still a mystery. Her body has never been found. On September 8, 1991, 3 years after Richardson went missing, another body was found in the oil field on Calder Road. She has yet to be identified, so she is called Janet Doe. She was about 31 years old, had long brown hair, and a small frame. She had suffered a spinal injury long before she was killed, and it may have caused her to have mobility problems. She had been dead at least 6 weeks before she was found. The police suspected that Janet Doe, who was the fourth body found in the killing fields, was not the work of the same killer who was responsible for the first 3 killings. They think this because it had been 5 years since the last bodies were found. Also, Janet's body was found in a different spot in the killing fields than where the other 3 bodies were found. The area experienced another quiet period, and people were hoping after 2 decades of murders that the killings had finally come to an end. That hope was shattered on May 13, 1994, when 16-year-old Trellis Sykes went missing while walking to school in Houston. Her body was found that afternoon about 2 miles away from her school. She had been strangled and beaten. On February 1, 1996, 14-year-old Lynette Bibbs and 15-year-old Tamara Fisher went missing after spending the evening at a teen club in Houston. 3 days later, 40 miles away from where they were last seen, the bodies of both girls were found. They were found in a wooded area off Interstate 59 near Cleveland, Texas. Tamara had been shot in the forehead and below the left ear, and Lynette had been shot in the back of the head. 3 months later, on March 5, 1996, 13-year-old Crystal Baker was found under a bridge in Chambers County, Texas. She was last seen alive 2 hours earlier, 50 miles away, when she stormed out of her grandmother's home in Texas City after a family argument. She had been strangled to death. 13 months later, on April 3, 1997, 12-year-old Laura K. Smither left her family's home in Friendswood, Texas, to go for a jog. When she didn't return home, her parents called the police. Her body was found 2 weeks later in a retention pond in Pasadena, about 14 miles away from her home. She was wearing nothing but her socks. She had been strangled, and there were signs of trauma to the head. A month after Laura disappeared, on May 17, 1997, 19-year-old Sandra Sapa stopped at a convenience store on Nassau Road 1, just 7 miles away from where Susan Eads was killed 14 years earlier. A man pulled her into his truck and drove off. As he drove away, Sapa, who was pregnant at the time, jumped out of the speeding truck. She luckily wasn't too injured, and another motorist picked her up. Luckily, the fetus was not injured in her escape. On the night of June 7, 1997, a month after Sandra Sapa escaped from being kidnapped, 14-year-old Erica Ann Garcia went missing after visiting a teen nightclub in Houston. Her body was found the next day in a vacant lot about a mile from where she was last seen alive. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. 2 months later, on August 17, 1997, 17-year-old Jessica Kane, who lived on Tiki Island, which is part of Galveston County, attended a cast party for a play that she was in. A month later, she was supposed to start university to study criminology. Sadly, she never made it home after the party. She was last seen leaving the restaurant where the party was being held in Dickinson, Texas. Years went by, and no trace of Jessica Kane was found. The killings had also come to a stop, yet again. Then in the summer of 2002, the area was rocked by yet another murder. On the evening of July 12, 2002, 23-year-old Sarah Trusty left her home in Algoa, Texas, to go for a bike ride. Later that evening, she was seen at a church near her home. She didn't return home that night, and she was reported missing. The bike that she was riding that night was found in the foyer of the church where she was last seen, but she was nowhere to be found. On July 28th, just a little over 2 weeks after she set out on her bike ride, her body was found on the Texas City Dike, which is a levee in Texas City. The medical examiner was unable to determine how the 23-year-old woman died. On March 3, 2003, 16-year-old Maria Solis went missing after getting off a city bus close to her school in Houston. Nearly a year and a half later, her body was found by tree-cutting crews near Sugar Land. The cause of death has never been made public. After Maria's murder, the murders of young women and girls in the area finally seem to have come to an end. Starting with Colette Wilson in June 1971, at least 37 females were killed or went missing from the area between Houston and Galveston. The question then is, who is responsible for all these murders? As mentioned earlier in the video, it's suspected that at least 4 serial killers were active in the area throughout the 3 decades. In the years since the murders started, several men have been connected to some of the murders, and there have even been a few convictions. One of the strongest suspects for many of the murders is a man named Edward Harold Bell. In the 1970s, Bell was arrested several times for exposing himself to young girls. On August 24, 1978, Bell was cruising around in his pickup truck in Pasadena, Texas. He came across a group of young boys who were playing outside. He parked his truck and stepped out. He was naked from the waist down. As he walked towards the boys, he fondled himself. A woman named Dorothy Lane was inside her home looking out the window when she saw Bell get out of his truck. She called the police, and her son, 26-year-old Larry Dickens, heard her as she talked on the phone. Dickens, who was a former Marine, decided to do something about the situation. He went outside and took Bell's keys out of the ignition. Bell saw what Dickens did, and he demanded his keys back, but Dickens refused to give them back. Bell grabbed a pair of jeans from his pickup truck and put them on. He then picked up a handgun and he pointed it at Dickens. He told Dickens to give him his keys back or he'd shoot. Bell then fired a shot in the air. Dickens told Bell that he wasn't going to shoot anyone and he should just calm down. He then took 2 or 3 steps towards Bell. When he did, Bell shot him 5 times. After being shot, Dickens staggered to his garage and his mother came out to help him. She told Bell he should leave because the police were coming. Bell said he wasn't going anywhere until he got his keys back. Dorothy Ling took the keys from her son's hand and threw them at Bell. Bell went back to his truck, and Ling was hoping he would just drive away. Unfortunately, he didn't. Instead, he grabbed a rifle and walked back into the garage. While Ling begged him to leave her son alone, he fired several more shots into the 28-year-old father of 2. Bell then got into his truck and drove away. Larry Dickens died in his mother's arms. The police arrived a few moments after Bell had fled, so they sped off in the direction that Bell had just driven. He led them on a high-speed chase, and then when he was cornered on a cul-de-sac, he fired his rifle at the police officers. He tried to fire again, but his rifle jammed. After the rifle jammed, the police were able to arrest him without anyone else getting hurt. Amazingly, despite the incredibly violent and unprovoked nature of his crime, Bell was granted bail and he was released 2 months after he was arrested to await his trial. When it came time for his trial, Bell had vanished. 5 years later, Bell still had not been found, and the television program, Unsolved Mysteries, did a segment on him. The segment, which featured Matthew McConaughey in his first television role, aired in December 1992. 2 months later, thanks to tips from viewers of the show, Bell was arrested in Panama City, Panama. He was extradited back to Texas, and he was sentenced to 70 years in prison for murdering Larry Dickens. In 1998, while serving his sentence, Bell wrote a letter to the district attorney saying that he killed 7 girls in Galveston in the early 1970s. However, the letter was kept secret for 13 years. During those 13 years, Bell's confession wasn't investigated. In the letter, he named 3 victims and described the other 4. In the letter, Bell claims that he killed Debbie Ackerman and Maria Johnson, who were both 15 years old, and they were the 9th and 10th victims. They went missing in November 1971 from Galveston. He wrote that another one of his victims was a teenage girl with reddish blonde hair named Pitchford. It's believed that he was referring to 16-year-old Kimberly Pitchford, who was killed on January 3, 1973, after attending a driver's ed class at a high school in Houston. The other girls he described were believed to be 13-year-old Colette Wilson, who went missing from Alvin, Texas in June 1971, 19-year-old Gloria Gonzalez, who went missing from West Houston in October 1971, and her remains were found near Colette's remains, and finally, he said he killed 2 girls from Webster. It's believed that he is referring to Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw, who went missing in August 1971. They were the 3rd and 4th girls to disappear. What is troubling about Bell's confession is that someone was already sitting in prison for the murder of Sharon Shaw. In May 1973, Michael Lloyd Self was convicted of the crime, and he was given a life sentence. Self died in prison in 2000, 2 years after the district attorney received the confession letter from Bell. Self went to the grave maintaining his innocence. Then in the autumn of 2017, the Houston Chronicle interviewed Bell in prison, and he said he didn't just kill the 7 girls. Instead, he said that there were 11 who went to heaven. He didn't name the other 4 victims, but he described them. It's believed that they were 14-year-old Georgia Greer and 12-year-old Brooks Bracewell, who were together when they went missing in 1974. He said he picked up another victim on the side of the highway, and it's believed that he was talking about 16-year-old Nina Lynn Klug. She was murdered in 1975. The description of Bell's supposed 11th victim didn't match any known murders or disappearances. He said she had reddish blonde hair, and he killed her in the mid-1970s. Records show that Bell was living in the area when the girls were killed, and in some cases, he had personal connections to the places where they were last seen. Also, several of the girls were last seen getting into a van, and Bell owned a van at the time. Despite his confession, Bell has never been charged with any of these murders because there is no physical evidence proving he committed the murders. Some people don't think that Bell committed the murders, and he is just taking credit for them. Another suspect in some of the murders is Clyde Edwin Hedrick. Hedrick was arrested in July 1985 after the body of 29-year-old Ellen Ray Beeson was found stuffed under a couch that was abandoned near the Galveston Causeway. In 2013, the police decided to re-examine Beeson's death, and they had her body exhumed. Another autopsy was performed, and it was determined that she died from blunt force trauma to the head. 28 years after Beeson died, Hedrick was arrested, and he was charged with involuntary manslaughter. In 2014, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. After his arrest, the police started looking into his past, and they interviewed his former girlfriends. Several of his ex-girlfriends implicated him in the murders of 23-year-old Heidi Villarreal Fife and 16-year-old Laura Miller. Both young women went missing from the same convenience store. Villarreal Fife went missing in October 1983, and Laura went missing in September 1984. Both of their bodies were found in the field on Calder Road. It's also believed that Hedrick is responsible for the murder of the Jane Doe, who was found in the field in February 1986. Hedrick claims that he didn't kill the 3 young women who were found in the field, and no evidence ties him to the murders. As for the second Jane Doe, who was found in the field in 1991 and is called Janet Doe, a man has confessed to that murder. Mark Rolling Stallings said that he picked up the woman, who was strung out on drugs, on Nassau Road 1, and he killed her. When Stallings admitted to the murder, he was incarcerated. He is serving a life term for kidnapping and assault with a deadly weapon. The charges stem from an attempted prison escape. He tried to escape while serving 2 50-year sentences for burglary and for shooting a man through an open window. The man he shot was wounded, but he didn't die. Stallings has never been charged with the murder of Janet Doe. He is also the prime suspect in the murders of 2 other women who are not connected to the Texas Killingfield murders. Another suspect is a man named Robert Abel, who is Mark Rolling Stallings' boss when he supposedly killed Janet Doe. Abel was a former NASA engineer, and he owned the property next to the oil field on Calder Road, where the bodies of the 4 young women were found. The FBI developed a profile of who may have killed the 4 women, and Abel matched the profile perfectly. However, there was no evidence or eyewitnesses that connected him to the murders. Also, he had no criminal record. The FBI profile was enough proof that Abel was the killer for Tim Miller, who is the father of Laura Miller, whose body was found in the field in 1986. Tim Miller claims that he even went to Abel's home and held a gun to his head. However, Abel denied that ever happened. Tim Miller now thinks that Clyde Hedrick is the person who killed his daughter. Robert Abel has never been officially cleared as a suspect. He swore he was innocent, and he said that the accusations ruined his life. In July 2005, Abel was killed when the golf cart that he was driving was struck by a train. A 5th suspect in some of the murders is serial killer Anthony Allen Shore. In October 2003, Shore was brought in for questioning after cold case investigators linked DNA found under the fingernails of 21-year-old Maria del Carmen Estrada, who was sexually assaulted and strangled to death in April 1992 in Houston. Shore confessed to that murder, and he also confessed to 3 other ones. He said he committed his first murder in 1986, over 5 years before he killed Maria del Carmen Estrada. He said he kidnapped 15-year-old Laura Lee Tremblay from Houston as she was walking to school. She was the only one of his victims who wasn't sexually assaulted, but like the rest of his victims, he strangled her to death. Then 2 years after he killed Maria del Carmen Estrada, he claimed his 3rd victim. He kidnapped 9-year-old Diana Reballer in August 1994 in Houston as she was walking the block from her home to a convenience store. Finally, he admitted to killing 16-year-old Diana Sanchez in July 1995. He got her into his van after offering her a ride home and then strangled her to death with a yellow cord. Shore was convicted of the 4 murders and he was sentenced to death. In the lead up to his execution, Shore confessed to a murder associated with the Texas killing fields. Texas Rangers interviewed him on death row, and they determined that he didn't know the right details about the crime. The Rangers also questioned him about the murder of Susan Eads, and after the interview, he was cleared as a suspect. Shore was executed on January 17, 2018. A 6th suspect is a man named Kevin Edison Smith. Smith worked for oil companies as a welder. In September 2010, he was arrested for the 1996 murder of Crystal Baker, the 32nd victim. Crystal was last seen alive by her family when she stormed out of her grandmother's home in Texas City, and she was found 2 hours later under a bridge. In October 2009, a cold case investigator had DNA under her fingernails and on her clothes tested. It was male DNA, but it didn't match anyone in the database. Then 11 months later, Smith was arrested on an unrelated charge in Louisiana. A DNA sample was taken, and when it was put into the database, it was matched to the DNA found under Crystal's fingernails and on her clothes. He is suspected of committing other murders, and not just in Texas, but in Louisiana, Arizona, and North Carolina. However, he has only been charged with killing Crystal Baker. He was convicted of that murder in April 2012, and he was sentenced to life. A final suspect is a man named William Lewis Reese. Reese was released from prison in Oklahoma in 1996 after he served 10 years for 2 sexual assaults. When he got out of prison, he got a job in construction, and even though he lived in Oklahoma, he often worked on construction sites in Texas. After the murder of 12-year-old Laura K. Smither in April 1997, he was considered the prime suspect, but he was never charged due to a lack of evidence. In May 1997, he kidnapped Sandra Sapa, who escaped by jumping out of his truck as it was moving. Reese was arrested 5 months later for attempting to kidnap Sandra Sapa. He was convicted and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Unfortunately, in those 5 months between the attempted kidnapping and his arrest, Reese committed several more murders. First, he killed 20-year-old Kelly Cox. On July 15, 1997, Cox disappeared after touring the Denton County Jail with her criminology class. She called her boyfriend and said that she locked her keys in her car. When he arrived at the jail with a spare key to the car, Cox was nowhere to be found. On July 26, Reese kidnapped 19-year-old Tiffany Johnson from a car wash in Bethany, Oklahoma. She was later found strangled to death. DNA evidence linked Reese to Johnson's murder in 2015. In March 2016, Reese directed the police to a field that is 30 miles south of Houston in West Orem. Buried in the field, they found the remains of Kelly Cox. In the same field, they also found the remains of 17-year-old Jessica Kane, who disappeared on August 17, 1997, after she attended a cast party for a play that she was in. Reese has been charged with the murders of Laura K. Smither, Kelly Cox, Tiffany Johnson, and Jessica Kane, but he has yet to go to trial for any of those charges. Out of those 7 suspects, it is thought that they are responsible for 20 of the 37 murders. It's possible that the 7 men are responsible for more murders, just not near the killing fields, but in other states as well. Also, there are the 4 men who claim they were innocent, but they were nevertheless convicted of 3 of the murders in 1972. One of those murders was the murder of Sharon Shaw, which Michael Lloyd Self was convicted of, and Edward Bell took credit for her murder in his letter in 1998. If the other 3 men really did commit the other 2 murders, that still leaves 15 unsolved murders. This includes the murder of Susan Eads. The police are hoping that someone will recognize the voice of the mysterious caller, so that the friends and family of Susan Eads will at least know who is responsible for stealing her from their lives. Also, identifying him could bring closure to many other families who lost daughters, sisters, and mothers around the Texas killing fields.
Hello? Hello? You said you knew Susan. Well, I still can't believe that I never knew of you. I don't understand that.
Some people have secrets, they like to keep themselves.
You have some pictures of her, you told me. I'd like to see them.
Just you, I ain't gonna show them to anyone else.
Would you want me to meet you somewhere?
My place or a motel or something like that.
Where'd you say? Houston?
Here's some photos.
Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you liked it, please subscribe for more videos just like it. Today's video is sponsored by one of my favorite YouTube channels, Biographics. Biographics is history, one life at a time. Every week, Biographics releases 2 videos that looks at the lives of people who changed the world for the better and for the worse. They have a lot of amazing videos, and just some of my favorites include their videos about H.H. Holmes, Pablo Escobar, and Ted Bundy. At the end of this video, I'll have a link to my favorite Biographics video. You can visit Biographics by following the link in the description box below this video. I just want to say a big thanks to Biographics for sponsoring, and now, here's today's video. Number 3. Harvey Robinson. Joan Burkhart grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. She excelled in school and she was a good athlete. She had many friends and she was a popular babysitter. But in 1986, when she was 23 years old, she started to have psychological problems. It turned out that when she was 10 years old, she was approached by a man who asked her to help him find his lost dog in the woods. When he got her alone, he sexually assaulted her at knife point. Burkhart did not tell anyone about the sexual assault, and she suppressed the memory. Then at the age of 23, when she was in college, she had a mental breakdown. For several years, she attended counseling. In 1990, it seemed that her life was turning around. She got a job as a nurse's aide, and she got her own apartment, which was on the ground floor in a safe neighborhood in East Allentown. On the evening of August 5th, 1992, Burkhart had a friend over. At 11 p.m., she left her apartment to drive her friend home. When she returned home about 90 minutes later, she noticed that something was off. She had left a fan on, but it was turned off when she came home. Also, when she left her apartment, the patio door was open and the screen door was closed and locked. But when she got home, both the patio door and the screen door were open, and there was a cut in the screen door. The cut was about 6 inches long, and it was near the locking mechanism. The cut was big enough for someone to reach their hand through and unlock the screen door. And then finally, about $50 was missing from her dresser. Otherwise, nothing else was missing or disturbed. Burhart reported the break-in to the police. 4 days after the break-in, Burhart's neighbors called the police. They had not seen her for about 3 days, and that was unusual. The last time they heard Burhart was on the night of August 6, which was less than 24 hours after she reported the break-in. The neighbors said it sounded like she was fighting with someone inside her apartment. The police went to her apartment, and they found a screen knocked out of a window. Officers were able to get into the apartment, and they found 29-year-old Joan Burhart dead in her living room. She had been sexually assaulted, and she had been struck 37 times with a blunt instrument. The murder weapon wasn't found in the apartment, and the police didn't know what object was used to kill Burhart. The police concluded that she was probably killed when she was getting ready for bed 3 days before she was found. The killer entered through her front window, and then he left out the back door. 10 months later, no arrests had been made. Then early on the morning of June 9, 1993, a person who lived a block and a half from Joan Burhart called the police. The caller said that the girl who delivered the newspaper, 15-year-old Charlotte Smoyer, had gone missing. She had delivered a newspaper to his neighbor, and her bike had been lying on the sidewalk in front of his neighbor's house for about 30 minutes. The police drove to the scene, and based on the evidence, they concluded that there had been a struggle and Charlotte had been kidnapped. The police conducted a door-to-door search of the area. An officer, who was following his instincts, went to the East Side Reservoir, which is about a mile from where Charlotte went missing. He found a bloody trail that led to her body, which was buried beneath some logs. She had been sexually assaulted, and she had been stabbed 22 times. Even though there were major differences between the two murders, like Burhart was beat to death in her home, and Charlotte was kidnapped and stabbed to death, there was some speculation that the killings were connected. Both murders were overkill, and both victims had been sexually assaulted. The victims also lived close to each other. Charlotte lived around the corner from Burhart, and she went missing about a block and a half away from Burhart's apartment. To get to the area where Charlotte was kidnapped, she would have had to pass by Burhart's apartment. The police wouldn't confirm or deny if they thought the crimes were connected. The police also wouldn't say if they had a suspect. But a few weeks after Charlotte was killed, it became painfully apparent that they didn't have a suspect. On June 20th, a mile and a half from where Charlotte was kidnapped and Burhart was killed, a 5-year-old girl was attacked in her home. She was sexually assaulted, but she survived. Unfortunately, the attack didn't give the police any leads. 38-year-old Denise Sam Kelly lived in East Allentown with her husband. She lived about a mile from Joan Burhart and Charlotte Smoyer's homes. On the night of June 28, 1993, Sam Kelly was home alone because her husband was out of town. In the middle of the night, Sam Kelly was awoken by strange noises that were coming from inside a walk-in closet just outside of her bedroom. Suddenly, a man burst out of the closet. Sam Kelly got out of bed and she ran. She got out of the house, but the man grabbed her and dragged her back inside. Sam Kelly fought with her attacker, and she managed to bite him on one of his arms. She was punched 4 times in the face, and then she was sexually assaulted. She was strangled and then left for dead. But Sam Cowley wasn't killed in the attack, and she called 911. She was taken to the hospital, but she was released later that day. After the attack, Sam Cowley and her husband left town for several weeks. Less than 2 weeks later, on the morning of July 14th, the family of 47-year-old Jessica Jean Fortney noticed that she hadn't woken up. They went into her bedroom, and they were horrified by what they found. The room was splattered in blood. Fortney's dead body was laying on the floor. Her face had been beaten to a pulp. The medical examiner concluded that Fortney had been sexually assaulted. She had also been punched multiple times in the face and strangled. The killer wore a ring that made indentations in her skull when he punched her. The cause of death was manual strangulation and blunt force trauma. The medical examiner found 50 distinctive wounds on her body. 4 days after Fortney was killed, Denise Sam Cowley and her husband returned home. At about 4 a.m. on the morning after they returned, Sam Cowley was awoken by a noise. She then heard her back door open.